The proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start shortly.
Motion for debate. Love Matters, the report of the Archbishop's Commission on Families and Households. The Lord Archbishop of Canterbury.
My Lords, I want to start by thanking the usual channels for allowing me to hold this debate today. And I am very grateful to all noble lords who've come today to participate in the debate or just to be here for the debate. On these benches, we do not take it for granted in any way at all that we have this remarkable privilege of having a debate roughly once a year, and it is a great honour to be allowed to do so. Families rarely matter. It's obvious, we know that. But we forget sometimes why. They are the fundamental building blocks for a flourishing society. This was both the motivation for and the conclusion of the Archbishop's, plural, Families and Households Commission, of which the co-chair was the noble. Now, do you know, I get in as much of a muddle on this as your noble lordships always do. I could just say him just down there, the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham. I've been called all kinds of things, even kindly. I pay tribute to the Commission's members who worked for over 2 years on this, and particularly its chair, Professor Janet Walker, and all those who took part and gave evidence to the Commission. It was the final of a series of commissions which grew out of a book I wrote in 2018 called Reimagining Britain. The book encouraged us to reimagine a society which is dedicated to the flourishing of the common good of peoples and communities. A commission on housing, church and community reported in 2021, and the Reimagining Care Commission reported also at the start of this year. For as long as human beings have existed, we've formed families and households. Families were the birthplace of society itself, and states followed on. They are a later creation. Families are the source of flourishing for so many. At their best, they are the place of belonging and security, of growth, care, healing and reconciliation, of training in being a citizen. They are where we learn to love and to be loved, to forgive and to be forgiven. They are where we learn about trust, respect, commitment and values, and learn to be safe and confident in our identity. But we know that families come in all shapes and sizes, in all different societies, and that the shape of the family has changed enormously in our lifetimes. They're not simply nuclear. My own childhood, as the press has widely reported when they've nothing better to talk about, was messy due to the alcohol addiction of my parents, and a few years ago I discovered, like many people, that the father I'd grown up with was not my biological father. Those who do not grow up with a stable, immediate family themselves, as I did not, often find hope and comfort and healing from being welcomed into and supported by other loving families as I was, or extended families. In my case, that included my grandmother, who cared for me in the times when my parents could not. For others, it's an aunt, an uncle, a godparent, a loving neighbour. Households and families, and I shall call them families for short throughout this speech, come in so many shapes and sizes. Those who are single, deliberately or by circumstance, also contribute greatly to households and families through friendship networks, and are usually part of extended forms of household. Our families and households grow, adapt, and age with us. We see the wonder of familiarity and change, the promise of renewal. If we have children or siblings, we are given the gift of viewing life at both ends, as both son and father, granddaughter and grandmother, nephew and uncle. The Commission expressed brilliantly, and I had nothing to do with it, its writing, expressed brilliantly the opportunity we have now to reimagine a society in which all families of all shapes and loving relationships are valued and strengthened. I know my Right Reverend friend, the Bishop of Durham, will speak more about the Commission's focus on valuing all relationships, including those of people who are single. But family must not be idolised. While it is very often the greatest source of contentment and hope, it can also be for many a cause of despair, unhappiness and trauma. The place where our human imperfections, which we know as sin, give way to harmful and destructive behaviours. We all know the statistics on domestic abuse and neglect. The NSPCC estimate that around 500,000 children suffer abuse in the UK each year. And the Office of National Statistics found that around 5% of adults had experienced abuse in the year ending March 2022, and about 80%, somewhere around that, of abuse happens within households and families. And in the Bible, family life is messy. Our complex relationships become part of the divine story of God, from Cain and Abel to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob's family, to the beautiful story of Ruth, and especially to the Holy Family of Jesus. So family matters. But what is it that defines families and makes them so crucial for our well-being and for that of our societies? And the answer is, and it sounds again banal, but I'll unpack it, the bonds of love. Oh yes, of course it is. What else might it be? Well, it's often forgotten. Throughout the Commission's work, they found that in the evidence they had from all places within and outside Christian faith or any other faith, love was the word most associated with family life, hence the title of the report. They said, love is undoubtedly the essential characteristic of supportive family life, which knows no boundaries and which is expected to endure through the best and worst of times. What do we mean by love, though? What we are not speaking of is an emotional feeling. We mean, and the report means, a deep love is at the heart of the Christian story. For God so loved the world that he sent his Son, Jesus Christ, both for our salvation, we believe as Christians, but also to model a radical new way of relating to one another, which is self-giving love without expectation of return. And love in the Bible is described in the most practical way. Here's a verse that almost everyone knows, or a passage. Love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. It's a passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's often read out at weddings, but has application far beyond. In my mind's eye, I see from a journey that my wife and I made late last year, where we stopped off at a service station for a bite to eat, and there was a very elderly couple, both finding extreme problems with mobility, married to each other, and they were supporting each other as they made their slow and painful way back to their vehicle. Nothing very dramatic, you might say, but it was a beautiful picture of love. Not the love we hear of so much in the novels. It was of resilient, enduring, sacrificing, self-giving love. That is the biblical position of love. So it's not just for the benefit of ourselves or our families, but for others. For sacrificial love develops in us the capacity to love and serve without self-interest. The Children's Commissioner has described a protective effect of the family. Family has the power to support its members through life's challenges. Family at its best is the first port of call in a crisis, and the place we can share both life's joys and sorrows with others who care for us. A colleague of mine is caring for a family who have just lost their second child in their lives to cancer. A young boy of 11 who died 2 weeks ago. And the wider family has gathered round and brings strength to these people who have suffered more than most of us can imagine, even those of us who are of that rare and unpleasant club that has lost one child. And that resilience that family brings is especially true for children. Family is the best place for children to grow up and develop resilience. And the evidence of the Commission, this is the evidence, it's not just a vague thought, is living with loving birth parents is best where possible, and when it is not, the state has an important role to play in ensuring that children can be integrated into other loving families which are stable and committed to one another. Stable and committed. That's not a question of sexuality, the evidence is. The Commission found there is now scientific consensus that the period from conception to age 5 is critical in providing the foundation for future physical and mental health, as well as overall well-being and productivity. The Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood, such an extraordinary foundation doing such remarkable work. In 2021, the government presented a vision, and this came partly out of their work, for the first 1,001 days through pregnancy to the age of 2, when the building blocks for lifelong emotional, physical, and emotional health are laid. There is evidence that mothers and fathers played the crucial role in these early years. The protective effect of family is particularly pertinent given the extraordinary rise of mental health challenges visible in both children and adults. The Church of England Children's Society concluded in their Good Childhood report of 2021, an annual production which I commend very strongly to your noble lordships. They said, the continuing downward trajectory of children's happiness with life as a whole and other important indicators suggest the UK is struggling to create conditions in which children can thrive. The Commission's call is for all of us as individuals, communities and government and the Church to put families at the very centre of all we do. So how can we enable bonds of love to flourish within families and households? Exhortation is useful. practical aid is essential, and that comes especially through basic needs like good housing, social care, education, healthcare, and nutrition. These are moral duties, not just economic calculations. But to what extent should this be the responsibility of government? As I said, the family predates society. So government may be useful or harmful to families, but stable families are indispensable to government and society. We literally cannot exist as a state without them, and not only because it would cost too much. Governments must seek to support the intermediate institutions, which are the only way of delivering effective family support at the local level. Those bodies and groups which sit between the family or the individual and the state, and have for much of history done the heavy lifting in care for one another's well-being and promoting the flourishing of society. All our commissions made recommendations to the Church and for other bodies in society, not simply to government, and that applies to this one. William Beveridge is often referred to as a father of the welfare state, saw the crucial importance of voluntary institutions in his 1942 report, where he identified the 5 giants to be conquered. He wrote, "The state, in organising social security, should not stifle incentive, opportunity, responsibility. In establishing a national minimum, it should leave room for and encouragement for voluntary action by every individual to provide more than the minimum for himself and his family." And in 1948, Beveridge wrote in his less remembered and much ignored follow-up, Voluntary Action, how much, it is gendered language, but it's 1948, how much all men owe to voluntary action for public purposes in the past, and suggested how voluntary action can be kept vigorous and abundant in the future. There is a crucial role for individuals, churches, and other charities and institutions to play in putting families first. The ideal is for the state to act in such a way as to create a positive reinforcing loop, a force multiplier, with the actions of individuals, intermediate institutions, and families themselves, to make space for families, neighbours, and communities to care for one another. And I will focus in this final bit of the speech on 2 areas where the government, through its legislation, regulations, and example, can promote the flourishing of families and households. The first is ensuring that whenever a policy is created in any government department, its impact on families and households is considered and acted upon. Does it enable the bonds of love within the family, the household, to flourish? Does it support and strengthen relationships? This week we hear that many people in this country will be prevented from living together with their spouse, child or children, elderly parents, as a result of a big increase in the minimum income requirement for family visas. The government is rightly concerned with bringing down the legal migration figures, and I'm not, you'll be relieved to know, going into the politics of that. But there is a cost to be paid in terms of the negative impact this will have on married and family relationships for those who live and work and contribute to our life together, particularly in social care. The family test already exists. It was introduced by the noble Lord Cameron's government in 2014 and seeks, through 5 questions, to introduce a family and household perspective into the policy-making process of every department. I know that DWP, and Noble Lord the Minister, I suspect, will comment on this, I know that DWP are currently conducting an internal review to look at ways to strengthen the test. That's welcome. The family test should be on the front of every bill. It should have practical implications for policy, from Treasury spending decisions to the impact of sentencing in the criminal justice system, on which I look forward to hearing more from my Right Reverend friend, the Bishop of Gloucester. And so the main thing I urge government is to consider giving the family test, and with the support of the opposition, greater teeth to support its implementation across government departments. Will they require completion and publication of the assessments to increase transparency in learning across government? Will they also consider reviewing the questions asked within the test to focus more on children and on all aspects of well-being, emotional, social, spiritual, and material? Let me remind you what I said a few minutes ago. The state is useful to the family. The family is indispensable to the state. A lack of strong families undermines our whole society. Government needs families to work. They must not set a series of hurdles for them to jump over. Another key consideration with regard to policy is whether it is family-proof. Is it flexible enough to accommodate the different ways in which family lives? One example is the 2-child limit on benefits. I pay tribute to the tireless work of the Bishop of Durham for his campaigning in this area. The End Child Poverty campaign estimates that removing the 2-child limit would lift 250,000 children out of poverty. The moral case is beyond any question. Yet the unfair penalty applied to additional children affects their educational outcomes, mental and physical health, their likelihood to require public support from public services later on. It is not a good policy. Will the government and the opposition, should they become the government at some point, consider removing the 2-child limit and addressing other systems and policy choices which keep families in poverty? Finally, supporting families. I am conscious of the time. Supporting families, housing and social care. The Joseph Rowntree's Foundation on a recent report on destitution revealed that around 3.8 million people experience destitution, total absence of resources, not just poverty, including around 1 million children in 2022. That was 2.5 times the number in 2017 and triple the number of children. Our social security system, designed by Beveridge to reach everyone, is simply staggering under the burden of trying to meet the needs. The situation is grave, especially for those who are disabled. In addition, our Housing Commission highlighted a chronic shortage of social and affordable housing. Good housing, sustainable, safe, stable, sociable, and satisfying, is necessary. They integrate in supporting families. The Reimagining Care Commission called for a national care government to clarify the responsibilities of everyone, government and others, in care and support. Putting families first requires a long-term approach. And so I urge all parties, as we move towards an election year, to place flourishing families and households as a key objective within their manifestos at the next election, and to recognise their responsibility and self-interest for the well-being of adults and children alike, for transforming the way our society operates. Herbert's famous poem, Love Bade Me Welcome, speaks of the sacrificial love of Christ who welcomed him in when he did not deserve it. Flourishing families are the place where we experience similar love and welcome. Love matters, my lords. Families matter. Relationships matter. I urge us all to seek ways to support their flourishing. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, it's a great privilege to follow the Most Reverend Primate, and I congratulate him on a very powerful speech. I agree with much of what he said, and especially his statement that family is indispensable to the state. In fact, when I saw the subject of his debate this year, I was particularly pleased because there's nothing that matters more to me than family. But I have to confess, my heart sank a little when I read the Love Matters report, as interesting as it is. I was pleased, as a single person myself, to see the status of single being included in the report, and I look forward very much to the Most Reverend Bishop of Durham, I forget which one it is, who's going to speak about single. I look forward to that. I don't know whether it was meant to make me laugh, but it amused me that in the bit about single status, Jesus was held up as a great example of a single person, and I thought, well, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. But in a report from the Church of England about love and families, I had expected to find marriage front and centre. It is in there, but it isn't, for example, mentioned in the key messages or the key priorities for action. And I was surprised, actually. I don't think that the Most Reverend Primate mentioned marriage in his speech. We all understand how important it is not to discriminate or judge families that take different forms, and the Most Reverend Primate reminded us of his own. Relationships do break down irretrievably. It's right that women, for whatever reason, can choose whether or not to marry the father of their child, and like women, men too can find themselves alone, bringing up children through no fault of their own. In all these situations, there are fantastic parents whose children grow up to be fantastic adults, and nobody disputes that. Even so, we ought to be able to say, and I think the Church of England should say, that marriage is nonetheless the most secure and optimum arrangement for couples who want to commit to each other, especially if they want to bring up a family and create the best chances for their children to succeed. And I find it hard to understand why it doesn't, because even though take-up of marriage in the UK has halved since 1990, the benefits of being married are clearly evident to high-income couples, as 83% of us choose to do it. Yet we seem happy to ignore the fact that 45% of low-income couples don't choose all the benefits of marriage that we enjoy. My lords, if we want a strong and cohesive society that is more equal in providing opportunities, we should do everything we can to turn this situation around. One of the great things about marriage is that it transcends difference: religion, age, class, education, ethnicity. And since Parliament passed the Same-Sex Marriage Act 10 years ago, it's available to any couple who wants to honour the institution and gain all the benefits it has to offer. Now, I know that gay marriage remains a contested and difficult issue within the Church of England. I don't know if it's resolvable, and I mean this really sincerely, it's not for me to tell the Church what it should do. I am as committed to religious freedoms in the context of gay marriage as I am to people's freedom to say they disagree with it. But what I do know is that not promoting the benefits of marriage to society as a whole will make its internal difficulties on gay marriage that much harder for the Church to resolve. My lords, because this year marked its 10th anniversary, I have reflected quite a bit on the way we succeeded in passing the Same-Sex Marriage Act through this House. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand that the challenges facing the Church are greater and far more complex than any that a government faces when trying to pass a contentious bill through Parliament. But there are lessons worth highlighting, and something for all of us, politicians, the government, church, to learn from going over some old ground. And by the way, as it's been a while and some in the chamber today might not remember, I was the minister in charge of the Equal Marriage Bill. As noble lords will recall, the bill had been fiercely contested in the House of Commons. And whilst it left the other place with a large majority in favour overall, the majority of Conservative MPs had voted against it. The expectation was for similar difficulties here. Indeed, uncertainty was very evident amongst many peers, and not just on the Conservative benches. So I decided that we, the ministers and Bill team officials, would take a different approach. Essentially, we reassured rather than demonised those who were against or unsure whether to support what, at that time, was a radical change. We made being unsure about the bill a perfectly respectable position to hold. We worked hard to demonstrate that all the legitimate concerns of those opposed to gay marriage on religious grounds had been taken seriously, and we amended the bill further to provide the clarification and comfort some sought when it cost us nothing to do so. Our approach neutered the political opportunists, who, quite frankly, didn't care about marriage much anyway, from using the bill to cause division. And instead, we created the right conditions for us to make a positive case for what we were trying to achieve. Our argument was that the legal difference from civil partnership for gay couples was zero, but opening up marriage was profound. Yes, it would make a big difference to the lives of gay couples previously excluded by giving their committed relationship equal social status to those of a straight couple getting married. But the bill was even bigger and more important than all of that. Passing it would future-proof the institution of marriage itself. In short, and this was the critical point, all of us would gain from this important change to our law. We won the division at second reading by a larger margin than in the Commons, and a majority of Conservative peers helped us win that and every other division during the passage of the bill. Afterwards, public acceptance of equal marriage grew swiftly, and I felt that the lesson from what we had achieved was clear. Profound social change can only be successful if it's beneficial to everyone and its purpose is a stronger and more cohesive society. And by the way, it's okay if some people benefit more directly than others, as long as their gain is not at other people's unfair expense. Equal marriage didn't happen because of our differences or what divides us. It happened because during those few weeks in the summer of 2013, we understood marriage upholds important values that we all share. But we seem to have forgotten that lesson. And sometimes I think maybe we didn't learn it at all. Because collectively, and I mean the government, Parliament, the Church, all of us, we have done little, if anything, since to promote marriage and why it's the best kind of setting for couples and families of all kinds. We shouldn't be surprised then that the rate of marriage has continued to fall. And at the rate it's going, some predict it won't even exist in 40 years' time. Well, I said earlier that the Church of England might never get as far as allowing gay marriage in church. And whether it does or not isn't actually what matters most. Promoting the institution of marriage to society is more important if that institution is to survive. And doing that would, I think, help future-proof the Church itself. And the purpose of both institutions surviving into the future is the role they have in ensuring a strong, cohesive society for the benefit of us all. I hope the Most Reverend Primate can at least agree with me on that.
Yeah.
My Lords, thanks are due to the Archbishops and their Commission for producing this report. Drawing on a wide range of knowledge and experience, it provides a good basis for discussion of these important issues. I particularly welcome the speech by the Most Reverend Primate the Archbishop of Canterbury, in stressing the importance of a partnership between families and the state. People have suggested that the family was everything and the state was a subsidiary part, but it's a partnership between the two, and quite rightly, the Most Reverend Primate stressed the role of the state in relation to the family, and I very much welcome that. Now, I thought it would be helpful for a committed atheist to contribute to this debate, if only to emphasise that believers do not have a monopoly on recognising the needs of families and individuals within society. Now, I'm going to avoid the theology. I'm going to look at the practical proposals and make a number of comments where I think there's more work to be done. But first, I just wanted to say I have a problem often with the use of the term family in this and similar discussions. Its use is particularly questionable in political discussions, where it is often used as a way of dividing rather than uniting. Whenever the word is used, you must ask yourself, what counts as a family? At least here in the report, the particularly suspect term hard-working families, too often used when discussing social policies, doesn't appear. In awful truth, it's sometimes used in the form of dog whistle politics, suggesting that there is the other, be it the deserving and the undeserving poor, or us and them. But if the term family is going to be defined as including everyone, it loses all meaning. So who is it that is being excluded when we use the word family? I'm therefore pleased, and I give tribute, that obviously care and attention has been taken in drafting this report to avoid this trap. I assume that this is deliberate. As the report itself notes, terms such as family-friendly can be alienating for people without children and those who live alone. They must be used with great care. So, while the report argues that strong and stable families and households are the foundation of society, it then goes on to call for singleness to be recognised and honoured and a major part of society. All well and good to see. It does suggest, however, that a lot of words could have been saved in producing the report by just referring to everyone. The report also notes that family life can be difficult and messy. All too true, although I will avoid the temptation to quote Philip Larkin. The report concludes, therefore, that all relationships can benefit from support at different life stages. The key here is different life stages, which brings me to the main point I want to make in this debate, which is what I believe is a serious omission. I may be wrong, I may misunderstand the report, but as far as I can see, there is no specific reference to issues that arise with families and relationships with increasing age, be it failing faculties, ill health, or ultimately bereavement. There's no reference to old age or pensions or elderly family members. Only one reference to retirement, which can be such a seminal event in anyone's life, and nothing specific about those who, through choice or circumstances, grow old alone. I have to ask whether this is deliberate. Was it thought simply that a general age-blind approach was right? I suspect not, as children do get a mention, with one of the priorities being identified quite rightly as ensuring that they get the best possible start in life. Either way, I must express some disappointment. Forgive me if I have misunderstood what is in the report, and in any event, I am not suggesting for a moment that the Commission doesn't care about the elderly. But the elderly do have specific issues that need to be addressed in the context of the issues dealt with in this report. And I suggest that these might have been expressed more explicitly in its recommendations. Now, looking at the report, it includes 36 recommendations for the Church of England and 29 for the Government. Forgive me if I avoid commenting on those for the Church, but turning to those for the government, there is a number. I would like to give some examples where specific reference could have been made to the elderly. This includes where reference is made to life transitions. It should be kept in mind that facing up to old age is often difficult. Looking around this chamber, I feel that many will witness to that. Now, it's not all negative, of course. It can be a form of liberation, providing new opportunities for development. But relationships might change, and certainly, as I can testify, slowly but inexorably, new life-changing issues arise that must be confronted. Yeah. The report also stresses that strong and stable relationships in every family and household should be a priority for every government department, suggesting a cabinet-level minister holding responsibility for the implementation, oversight and publication of a family review. I think care for older family members should obviously be part of such a review, which has important implications for government policy, or perhaps more accurately, lack of policy and financing for an adequate social care service. Then there's the call on the government to value families in all their diversity, meeting their basic needs by putting their well-being at the heart of government policy and our community life. Right. But one form of diversity is the growth of multi-generation households. ONS figures, for example, have shown a steady rise in 3-generation households, which would typically include older people. I surmise that this is due to growth in certain parts of our community, and I'm sure support will be needed to ensure their well-being, for example, more housing tailored to their particular needs. And finally, I might mention the welcome call in the report to honour singleness and single-person households, recognising that loving relationships matter to everyone. This again is particularly important where people are newly single, typically at older ages, having to cope with their death of their partner after many years together. To conclude, I'm sure that there are other examples, and in no sense is it a criticism of the work that has been done. It's pointing a pathway to what more needs to be given, the attention required to the needs of the elderly.
My Lords, I am pleased to rise to broadly support what I consider to be the main thrust of the report of the most right Reverend Prelates, although I believe one is a primate. My Lords, I am not a good sleeper, and last week, awake at 3:30, I decided to grab the iPad and actually read Love Matters. My first thought, if I am being honest, is that it sounded like the title of a book your parents might hide in their bedroom, Love Matters. I also hoped it would be a cure for insomnia, but how wrong I was on both counts. I found it to be a lucid, challenging and compelling read. I was still there at 6 o'clock. From the Lord Archbishop's introduction onwards, it was quietly explosive. Now, it wasn't that it was saying things that we didn't know. In fact, that was perhaps a disappointment. The facts and the data of all the chapters are known to us. And I'm sure there are clearly some omissions, as noble lords will point out. But the report did make a very readable narrative of those facts. It wasn't the interpretation of the facts, because they too are known to us. For example, poor housing leads to poor outcomes, to name but one. It was the fact that we were challenged to look at the solutions to those known facts as problems through what I called the love lens. The definition of love, as explained by the Lord Archbishop within a biblical and religious context, is used a lot in the report, which makes it very, very different from any normal public policy documents. Its fundamental tenet, as we have heard, is that families matter, relationships matter, and love matters if individuals are to flourish. And I agree It explains and expands the concept of family-ness support. It completely rewrites the definition of family that some would and have taken issue with. And yet, we would all surely recognise that love and meaningful relationships come in many different guises, and that all are valid and valuable. But it is important to remember that it is still obviously pretty controversial. Yet when we actually know people in those many and varied relationships, we can see that they often work in spite of our prejudices, perhaps because of the presence of something that's difficult to define, that I've called the something else, and the report bravely attempts to do just that. It does accept the fact of diversity as the lived experience in the 21st century and go beyond it to seek commonality and define that something else. The 12 independent commission members distilled down the essential essence of what makes those families work and what they need to flourish from what they saw and heard, rather than judging and proselytising a set position of what is a family and how it should function. From that point of view, the Church, it is a brave and bold and challenging report. Its messages have been hard for some Christians to hear, and probably those of other faiths too, because it is very, very explicit that whilst being part of a family is central to our existence as human beings, we should recognise and value the diversity of families and households, and much more significantly reflect this more honestly in policy making. We should seek to create solutions that build relationship capability and resilience. Perhaps easier said than done, but the report tries to pin this down to many practical and tangible recommendations. I felt that the report reflected reality, pulling together the many threads that affect families and bind us together as a society. And it exposed that in parts the threads are wearing thin and in other parts snapping, and indeed that there are many holes in the social fabric of life. There are many sensible, proactive recommendations, like much more support for couples getting married, partnered, making decisions about having children or separation, in crucial life-making decisions that are often traumatic for children. But all too often, support is missing. It's just not there. It's at best patchy and certainly not being promoted as what you do. The report lays bare the inadequacy of the support given to families as they make these big life decisions that have such an impact on many lives and ultimately society as a whole. There is a huge cost to failure. Thus, the blueprint for success in relationship is not in a formula such as one man plus one woman plus marriage, in brackets, preferably in church, plus children equals happily ever after. Because we know that for many, that formula is not an end in itself, but it is what makes up loving and stable relationships to me that is more important. And I agree with Philip Larkin from personal experience. The report takes you on a journey and challenges us that if we use that family lens test, the family test of youth policy, it might just produce better outcomes, because it is certain that if we do what we always do, we will get what we always get. But for me, the real challenge from the report that was missing is how do you start to demonstrate that family is at the heart of policy? What does that look and feel like when you're sitting down, be it in a council chamber or here or in select committees? How do you start to make policy in this way? It certainly feels a long way from how we do things now, though the report is helpfully peppered with good practice from different parts of the country. To conclude, to me it seems that faiths can sometimes be very harsh and judgmental about how people live their lives, which banishes them from church, mosques, synagogues and temples, because they know that they cannot live to those ideals. This just isn't real life to them. It is excluding and judgmental, and worse still, responsible for mountains of guilt that individuals feel that is so damaging to their mental health and well-being. Perhaps the real challenge for us all is how do we demonstrate that love matters in a world where the word is overused and trivialised to the extent that it is devoid of meaning. It strikes me that this report holds challenges for all of us, but also for the Church itself, which the report does not shy away from. I would like to end on a light note and a more hopeful one, as indeed the report too ends with reimagining the future. My Lords, the report references the Australian soap Neighbours as an example of what happens when neighbours become good friends. May I suggest that we have an equally good British example in Coronation Street? And my challenge is watch this Wednesday's December the 6th episode and you will see everything that the report evidences as a snapshot of modern life, albeit condensed into one street. In fact, I vouch that you could use that episode alone to conduct a very meaningful session on building that relationship capacity, community resilience, and that something else, which is gently at work in the actions of its many characters. But being a northerner, I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah. My Lords, I'm very sad not to continue the suggestion of Coronation Street. But may I congratulate the Archbishop's Commission on its brave report. Very welcome. It chimes with much work that I have done over many years. I found it very difficult to look through the report and decide which of the many subjects I would like to say something about today. So I want to pick up children, building a fairer society, and dysfunctional families. And no wonder I say dysfunctional families, because I was a family judge. So all my work was dealt with nearly all my work was dealt with dysfunctional families, or oligarchs changing their money so they didn't pay their wives. I chaired in 1987-88 the Cleveland Report on child abuse. And one of our recommendations was that the child is a person and not an object of concern. I would add, having heard many years since then how so many children are treated, children are absolutely not packages. I'm very impressed by the report's emphasis on children, and particularly on listening to children and young persons, and to take seriously what they have to say. I, unusually perhaps, children used to come and see me in my room, and I found quite young children gave me astonishingly accurate reports of what it was they were concerned about and how they thought I, as the judge, might be able to put it right. And in seeing a great many child psychiatrists and social workers who videoed, you get children as young as 5 or 6 who will give you an entirely accurate account of what has happened. And I have to say many times I preferred that from the 6-year-old to the 15-year-old who might well have an agenda. I don't underestimate the information that children can give, and it's crucial to listen to them, take them seriously, don't necessarily agree with what they say or do what they want, but give them a chance, as indeed the report underlines, to play their part in what goes on. Also, I just add the importance of recognition of child trauma and the lack of sufficient facilities to deal with that. I chaired a few years ago a commission on religion and belief in British public life. And we put in a report which we called Living with Difference. I was very interested in Love Matters recommending the building of a kinder, fairer, forgiving society. Because in our report, we suggested a high priority for interfaith organisations, religions and belief groups, educational institutions, public bodies, voluntary organisations, all to promote the opportunities for encounter and dialogue, particularly for young children, for young people and for children. And again, we learnt the importance of listening rather than talking to other people and learning from what other people could teach us. That seems to me to chime in with the report of the Archbishop's Commission. It seems also to me that the Church of England can do even more to promote the inclusive discussions between the Abrahamic and the Dharmic traditions. That does seem the one part of the work done by the Church of England that may not be as fruitful as it could be. Dysfunctional families. I'm very fortunate. I came from a stable family. I was very lucky. I was married for 64 years to one person I had. And I also had the tragedy of losing one of my 3 children. And one of the important things that I would just like to share with the House is the problems of dysfunctional families, some of which I would refer to briefly. One important point is that there's a lack of legal aid in family disputes. This was very sadly identified when very recently a judge was attacked by a litigant in person, obviously overcome by the appalling trauma for him of the court case. We obviously need not only more legal aid, we need more counselling, more mediation. We need help for families who are troubled. I declare that I am chair of a commission on forced marriage, and the commission has learnt how most families love their children, but it doesn't necessarily mean that objectively they do the best for them. Parents' view of love, honour, duty push some families into marrying a son or daughter without the consent to a person whom the family considers is appropriate for marriage and to join the family. This occurs, I must tell you, well beyond Southeast Asia and happens throughout the United Kingdom. In some cases, particularly sad is the gay son or the lesbian daughter who is married in a form of conversion therapy in order to honour the family and with the parents loving that adult child. I do hope that the excellent suggestions of the Archbishop's report will help to solve some, at least, of these problems. And I do hope that the government will support its recommendations.
I begin by thanking the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, for holding this debate on a matter that is not only foundational to the well-being of us as individuals, but the whole of society. And I should probably obviously declare my interest as co-chair of the commission that produced the report. I also thank him for the privilege of being asked to co-chair the commission alongside Professor Janet Walker. It was an honour to work with her and the 10 other commission members, to listen and speak to children, young people and adults from all faiths and from all walks of life. I thank each of the commission members who generously gave their time and expertise voluntarily to contribute to this. Their work has been invaluable. I also want to pay tribute to the Children's Commissioner for England for the way that she shared with us her work, which took place in parallel. Our conclusions are remarkably similar. My friend, the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, opened the debate by speaking poignantly on the importance of family. and I will speak on what is at the very heart of families, that is, relationships. Throughout the Commission, we've met and spoke with people from across the country. People from different backgrounds, ages, cultures and faiths. Despite these differences, there was a theme that echoed throughout all our conversations: the importance of family and loving relationships. For an individual and family to flourish, each person must have their basic needs met: water, food, clothing, enough money to live on, and a roof over their head. But true flourishing comes from loving relationships. It is through these relationships that we find support, connectedness, and belonging. Now, families today do come in all shapes, sizes, and structures. But what the Commission found is that what matters most is the quality of the relationships and love that we receive and give. We are made for loving relationships, to love and be loved. Family life is messy. Let's be clear, there are huge joys in family life. But there are also the stresses of life that can put strain on relationships. And the breakdown, separation or divorce of a committed couple relationship can be extremely painful and particularly detrimental to any children involved. Entering a long-term committed couple relationship with another individual is one of the most significant decisions we can make. Yet there is often little preparation beforehand. The pre-marriage course, developed by Holy Trinity Brompton, is a successful example of a course that helps prepare couples considering marriage and wishing to build a strong and lasting relationship. The course encourages couples to discuss issues they may not have considered, their hopes and fears, and the everyday worries that they will face together. Those who have done it are positive about its value. Throughout the Commission, we found consensus that marriage preparation should be made available to everyone forming a committed couple relationship. This is because we do believe that marriage, with the seriousness of the vows undertaken and the covenant made, is the best option. So I asked the government, will they ensure that all registrars are required to signpost couples to marriage and relationship preparation available in their community when the couple give notice of an intention to marry or form a civil partnership? Please note, we don't think registrars should do it. They should signpost to the experts who can. It is not only important for couples to be supported on entering a lifelong committed relationship, but at all stages. Relationship support should always be available, particularly during significant life transitions, whether that be entering marriage, having children, experiencing conflict, or grief and bereavement. I believe there is particularly great potential for relationship support to be made available through the emerging family hubs. There is already a welcome focus on parent-infant relationship support within family hubs, but greater emphasis on parent relationship support would further benefit the whole family. It has been encouraging to see many family hubs opening their doors for the first time in recent months as part of the Family Hubs and Start for Life programme. And I hope these hubs will be places where families can go in times of need, places where the whole family can receive the support they need to truly prosper. The Family Hub guidance provided to local authorities clearly states this, that voluntary, community and faith organisations should be key partners, collectively improving the reach and impact of additional support for seldom heard parents and families. Despite being well placed in communities and having the ability to help deliver family hubs cost effectively, there is currently very little evidence of engagement with the faith communities. So what steps will His Majesty's Government take to further encourage local authorities and hold them accountable in partnering with voluntary and faith communities as they develop family hubs. Research has demonstrated that the foundations of our relational capability are laid down in childhood. Learning about relationships should therefore begin as early as possible in a child's life and continue throughout their years at school. Friendship and family relationships, as well as intimate couple relationships, should be embedded in the school curriculum, along with the relational skills that are crucial to loving relationships, such as dealing with conflict and communication. This should include the good of marriage as a covenanted lifelong relationship. But relationships cannot simply be taught from textbooks. The ethos, behaviour and culture at a school and how staff relate to one another will teach a child far more on how to conduct healthy and caring relationships than any worksheet will ever do. And interestingly, on the train down this morning, I found myself sat opposite an RE teacher coming down to London for a course who also is involved in relationships education. I tested this out with her, and she said, "You're absolutely right, Bishop. The young people in my school don't want relationships education to be about the manual aspects of sex. They want to know how to deal with being better friends, to relate better to their parents, to one another." That's the heart of what they want in relationships education. Discussions around the importance of people who remain single, forming loving relationships, should also be included in relationship education. According to the Office for National Statistics, England saw more than an 8% increase in people living in single-person households between 2011 and 2021. People remain single for a wide number of reasons, some through choice, some because they have not yet met a life partner, some due to separation, divorce, or death. Our culture can idolise romantic relationships and indeed marriage, at times causing those who are single to feel inferior. This has been particularly true of the church. But single people are just as much relational and family people as those who are married, have children, or are in couple relationships. For many, family stretches beyond the biological, including friends, colleagues, neighbours, and members of their community. So support should not be limited to those in couple relationships, but everyone in society, regardless of their relationship status, must be supported and valued. I am reminded that Jesus remained single throughout his life, rooted in family and community. He was single, but a family person, although, of course, his view of family stretched to include those way beyond his close biological family. I encourage you to consider how we can reflect his attitude in the way that society values those who are single and in the policies that we make. How can we ensure that the value and dignity of each person, regardless of their relationship status, is truly recognised in our society? May I offer here a brief comment to Lord Davis of Brixton on reference to the elderly. You're absolutely right, sir. Our report is weak on that. But that's because we already had the Housing Commission report and the Social Care report that dealt with many of the issues that you raised. So you need to look at the three together to see the whole picture. I hope that helps. Today we are lifting the lid on a matter that is rarely spoken about in this House, yet impacts us all: love. The Commission itself concludes that, and I quote, "Love is central to how people think about family, and it's necessary for families and households to flourish. Love provides us with a blueprint for strong relationships. The New Testament provides a vivid yet simple understanding of love in its purest form, which sets the principles for how we should relate to each other. In St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, I'll make no apologies for repeating what the Archbishop of Canterbury said earlier. We are told that love is patient, love is kind, Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes in all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. This text, popular at weddings and funerals, frames love not as an unattainable ideal, but something which is deeply practical with Jesus Christ as our teacher. We see a description of love being worked out in human circumstances, relationships and situations with kindness and patience, laying aside boasting, pride and dishonour. It speaks of trust and perseverance rather than keeping records of wrongs or being easily moved to anger. What these verses make clear is that love is not a feeling, but an attitude, a choice, a commitment to give to and promote the flourishing of the other. Love puts others before self. If every family and household could aspire to this kind of loving as the foundation on which flourishing can be achieved, then our society would be stronger, kinder, fairer, and more just. Love is often separated from public life and policy making, yet it is through loving relationships that we truly flourish. By placing them at the centre of our policies, we can reimagine a society where everyone is supported and valued, regardless of their background, culture, age, relationship status, or family structure. Is this not the society that we all desire to live in?
My Lords, I think the standard set in 1 Corinthians is a tall standard for some of us to meet. I've only been married for 56 years to the same person, not as good as my noble friend, Lord Butler Schloss. I think our marriage only survives because we're in separate houses. He's leader of the House of Commons and I'm here. And quite often I have sort of referred to a comment given to me by the late Dukey Hussey, who was in this house, saying, "Murder frequently, divorce never." And within that context, I rather endorse my noble friend Baroness Stoll's comments that marriage does give an additional piece of glue, holding people together. A coalition I might have gone off in quite often, but we're married and therefore it's obligatory. And so I would urge those to say that there is a part of a marriage, but it has to be handled sensitively and appropriately. I speak also as somebody who worked in a child guidance clinic as a psychiatric social worker. I was chairman of a juvenile court. I was on the board of the Children's Society. And of course, I was the minister responsible for implementing the seminal Children Act of 1989, which still really has stood the test of time. And I remember so well the noble lady Butler Schloss and her inquiry. Having previously been juvenile court chairman, I was so aware of the issues involved. And the difficulty with children, it can be true, but it can be fantasy. Taking children away wrongly is a terrible thing to do. Leaving children in their homes and disaster ensuing is a terrible thing to happen. Very few understand the complexity of these decisions. Now, I am a committed Anglican. I was a lay canon at Guildford Cathedral. But like the Church of England, the Conservative Party I joined, no one was ever so vulgar as to ask you what you really believed. I mean, I own my own beliefs and faith. They're not imposed, and I'm not sure how well I would do at an examination asking about exactly what I believe, either by the Tory Party or the Church of England. But I am totally committed to the Church of England as it is. I also speak as a grandmother of 8, and I simply say, I come from a extended, close, united tribe. And there's mutual support and sharing and caring and holidays. And even then, bringing up children is a nightmare. They're demanding, they're difficult, coping with jobs and coping with holidays, and now children are supposed to have, I think it's a very bad thing, they have to be occupied every minute of the day with coaching on tennis or football or piano. I mean, there is no peace for a child now, which may be one of the reasons for some of the mental stress of teenagers. They're so exhausted with this sort of battery of sort of improvement they have from their parents. When they used to have more children, there was less intense pressure for them to be perfect and live up, let's be frank, to their parents' ideal. But I know only too well, not only having been Chancellor at Hull for 17 years, through my work for Frank Field at the CPAG, chairing a juvenile court, I know the chaos, the despair, the deprivation, the complete lack of support that so many families have. And the dilemma of real poverty isn't only a lack of resource, it's the complete unpredictability. You're not quite sure which house you're going to be in, you're not sure whether your partner's going to be there. It's just having no agency, no control, no ability to plan your life, as well as the financial difficulties. I always used to say, well, if you'd had a PhD in nutrition, maybe you could get by on the poverty wage. But then you had everything else organised in your life. These are families which the church knows so well, who don't have that opportunity, that control, that support. And therefore, I see these issues in that context. Now, I so warmly endorse and support Love Matters, and I commend I commend the Most Reverend Primate and the Right Reverend Prelate for all their wonderful work. To me, it's realistic, it's pragmatic, it accepts the world as it is. It doesn't hanker after a sentimental suburban picture of family life, which I really doubt ever existed anyway. I've always thought that over-idealistic goals make everybody feel a failure. It's like dieting. If you have a perfect picture of the shape you ought to be, you'll always be a miserable person. It's a bit the same in family life. You can only do your best. As Winnicott used to say, you've only got to be a good enough mother. You don't have to be a perfect mother, which I think is a great comfort. Many of you will have seen the Royal Shakespeare Company's wonderful production of Hamlet. And that reveals family life in Shakespeare's time. That didn't look all that tidy either. And I share the tributes to Professor Janet Walker. And I congratulate the Lord Spiritual for choosing such an excellent person to be the link, the chair. A probation officer for 10 years, with extremely troubled offenders, over 50 research studies into all aspects of family life, and a director of the really impressive Newcastle Centre for Family Studies. Recently, which I know my noble friend, Lord Robertson, would particularly like, she's done a report on the pressures for the MOD of military families. And again, it's useful, it's powerful, it's unsentimental, and it really rings home. The Most Reverend Prelate suggested that our flourishing as a society depends on flourishing families and households. Families and households must be at the heart of all our collective thinking and actions. And I absolutely agree with that. And I really endorse and approve and admire his book on reimagining Britain, which at the time I thought was particularly powerful and relevant to the real world in which we find ourselves. Now, we can analyse the problems, and there are a lot of problems, but I passionately think we should celebrate the many impressive initiatives across the country, so often facilitated by churches responding to local needs and problems. The church has always reached out. Look at the introduction of education. Look at the work of the Children's Society. Bob Holman, who started the first children's family centre in Bristol. I remember visiting it. The work of the National Council for Carers and their Elderly Dependents, Carers National Association now, happened because actually a Methodist priest noticed that all these single women with elderly dependents weren't coming to church. A very big problem if you don't go to church, because someone will start a charity to support your cause. But the church has been there as a sort of practical catalyst and facilitator to reach out and ensure that as we do all we can for the most vulnerable and the most frail. And I particularly pay tribute to a charity, ATD Fourth World, because even the most apparently hopeless parents, the parents whose children have gone into care, the parents who feel they failed against some standard of what they should be able to achieve, they want to be good parents. They want to be the parents they never had. They want to do the best for their children, and the failure compounds their own sense of failure. Lord Joseph, formerly of this House, talked about the cycle of deprivation, and we know those families for whom it's almost impossible to be the stable role model providing unconditional love for those for whom they're responsible. I so remember many of the early child abuse cases. It's really hard to understand. And what triggered the abusing behaviour in a particular stepfather, Heidi Cossiger's case it was that the child wouldn't say that he was her father. The child wouldn't say that she loved him. She would resist and resist, even at the consequence of harmful abuse. But it was the man's desire that he should be treated as her father and be a good person. The church can provide wonderful role models of consistency, but there must be consistency. I used to talk at the Trinity College Centre in Camberwell, and I used to say to those privileged and clever students coming from somewhere called Trinity College, Cambridge, where I know a few people who've been there, I used to say that do not promise anything to these children you won't deliver. Their whole lives have been people who promised a present, a holiday, a bicycle, anything, and failed and disappointed. If you're going to send a Christmas card, then say you'll send a Christmas card. But you don't want to compound these children's sense that all of life is adults who say one thing, do another, and really don't care. We accept unconditional love provides the blueprint for strong relationships and human flourishing. And of course people need to have their basic needs met, but it is relationships that really matter. And as the report acknowledges, it's the conflict between parents that's so damaging, more so than the separation itself. Separation is wretched, but people do live in single households, as has been so well expressed in the report and in the House today. But the dispute and the aggression and the vilification of each other is the real damage to the children. So I welcome the government's recognition of that priority through the Reducing Parental Conflict programme, making funding and support available centrally and locally, helping to address the conflict and thereby improve children's lives. And I particularly commend an organisation I hadn't previously known about, the Positive Parenting Alliance, which talks about the parent's promise, helping people going through separation and divorce. And what I like about this, it's not only the usual suspects, the charities and the foundation supporting, it's HR directors who are actually engaged in this initiative, which I believe is really relevant and to the point. Now, I have a concern that those families who don't live up to this idealistic norm may not feel welcomed in church because they don't live up to that ideal standard. But it seems to me that those who are separated, divorced, need the church all the more. I mean, Michael Marshall, in his colourful way, used to say churches should be for the bad, the sad and the mad. I mean, I take the point, and I hope you all do as well. And the attitude to divorce is quite quaint, given that divorce, or rather annulment, was a rather important factor when the Church of England was established, all the way back in 1534 by Henry VIII. So perhaps we should be more considerate of no-fault divorces and non-conflictual separations in the church. We should, as the report said, move from the language of hostility to the language of peace. The Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act was widely welcomed, but we must use that 20-week waiting period for support, information and advice for parents. It's fundamental that couples can talk openly and comfortably about their struggles without feeling criticised or alienated. And of course, even when there is divorce, they remain parents. Being a parent is not a role that you can divorce yourself from. And the challenge then is to ensure those divorced parents both retain an ongoing relationship with the children. Now, I just want to say more about Anglican clergy and laity. And in saying that, I refer to ministers and priests of all religions, because they're a dedicated and powerful force, handling what can be a relentless task. I used to speak a lot I was asked to speak to all the northern bishops' wives by the Bishop of Carlisle once. And I said, being married to a priest is exactly like being married to an MP. The Member of Parliament, is always spending their time helping other people's children, helping other families, supporting them at Christmas. But their own family is completely on the back burner. And it's a very difficult role. And indeed, I remember my own daughter, when I was the children's minister, I was absolutely never at home, working all the time. And I finally said to her, well, darling, if a strange woman knocks on the door and says she's your mother, let her in, it might well be her. But I think this is something experienced by a great number of similar people. And of course, in paying tribute to the clergy, let me just make a quick mention of Clive Potter, the vicar at my local church at St John's, Milford, where he served for 16 years. He didn't get a PhD in theology. He hasn't had a particularly privileged life. And he has been the most wonderful parish priest, uncomplicated, virtuous, available, Christian. And we said goodbye to him last weekend, and I did so with great love and admiration. And then again, the laity. I just say in passing, Claire Sandy, just the most wonderful woman who died last week, who was always there to support, to help the bad, the mad and the sad. Now, our work is hugely enhanced by the number of female clergy. Really remarkable for those of us where there were no female clergy in our living memory. And of course, particularly in this place, and I'm delighted that the Bishop of Gloucester is here, because she was the pioneer and she survived the test of time. And tremendous now that there are 5 female bishops, I believe. And but I do want to make a small point about the Lord's spiritual, because oh my goodness, I passionately want the Lord's spiritual to remain. I do not think they enhance their prospects by looking like a personal advertisement. I have spoken to virtually every bishop about removing the robes. You don't need to wear them. So long as the bishop saying prayers, officiating, is wearing a robe, you can then keep the robing room. But all the others really should modernise their attire and look more normal, even though in their dog collars and very attractive shirts. I have said this politely to so many Lord Spiritual that now I've had to call upon the House really to help me in my campaign. My Lords, I have so much more to say. I can only say love matters and the Church matters.
Yeah. And my Lords, I welcome this report, and I particularly welcome the Church basing a report on something from Scriptures. I mean, far be it for me to ever advise anyone in the Church on the structure of the Church, but I have been baffled over the years how much time the Church has been deflected into issues that don't appear to feature very much in the Bible, and yet here we have a report that uses a thematic, a concept, a word that is embedded in the theology at every level, quite in every verse, but in every chapter, one might say, and I would commend for that. As an aside, I haven't done an early morning revision, but I don't recall the word divorce featuring in the Scriptures. Perhaps it does, and I'm mistaken. But I'm advised it does once. Well, there's a good balance then, in terms of where the balance of work should be. I wanted to talk about separation, but a separation in terms of distance that I think is crucial to how this commendable report could actually assist in policy making. I think perhaps this could have been stressed more within the report, but if one compares with other faith groups, Judaism, Muslim faith, Hindus, Sikhism, then one sees again strong family structures. Without question, the whole concept of faith is a keybind. But I think there's something else more practical that we, as those attempting to in some way advise and influence policy making and decision making by the state, could understand from the comparator. And that is to do with distance or non-distance. What defines all those communities is that geographically they're rather compact. That the housing that people live in is very near. And that is, I think, a fundamental issue in relation to family. The term I've written down here, dysfunctional families. Well, no more dysfunctional than the family whose birth of their son will be celebrated in a week or two's time. A family that didn't have stable housing. Now, housing stock and availability of housing, it seems to me, is the single most fundamental issue in relation to family that there is. Now, I've been married for, I think it's 37 years, almost beginning to lose count. But I don't fetishize in the concept of marriage. But in the concept of family, I absolutely do, which is why I think this report is so helpful. But we live in a society where families are far less connected together. And that is a problem. It's a significant problem. When I was a representative for nearly 20 years in a former coal mining community, there were many families that experts could classify as dysfunctional families, families with problems. They survived, and I would say often thrived, despite the problems they had, because they lived together. If I was to hope for a second report, of which the expertise in this House would be profound, and I would suggest among the bishops would be profound, one on the role of grandparents in society. There is an expertise in this House. I have my own modest share of it, but I'm sure on the benches there are many such experts. In the community I represented, grandparents were critical to the upbringing of children. That often one didn't know who was really bringing up the child. If a daughter or a son, particularly daughter, had problems with drugs, alcohol, whatever else, and that wasn't uncommon, then the children in reality would be brought up by the neighbouring grandparents, or sometimes aunts, uncles, because the geography allowed it. But how did it allow it? It allowed it because, for all sorts of employer-based, profit-driven, I suppose, historically, concepts, housing was built that gave a choice in housing, both council housing, but also the biggest single provider of housing from the non-local authority state was, well, it was kind of the state, was the NCB, the coal board. So loads of mining housing, big family-sized housing. And people could get that housing. And the removal of that housing stock and that choice to rent housing near family is a fundamental in the destruction of society that we have and have seen in the last generation. And we're doing nothing about it. Baroness Stoll is a differentiation between well-off families and poorer families. Housing is the fundamental in that. I can afford to choose to live near my grandchildren because I could purchase property there. An exception to that would be if they're in London, in which case that would be beyond me now, and therefore beyond most people. But we've allowed a distortion in the housing market, both the private market, where London is a classic example, but certainly not the only city across the world, but in our country, the prime example. But in the rented sector, we've allowed it as a coherent entity to disappear. And therefore, my grandparents, 2 of them, would visit me as a child twice a week. I would visit them once a week. Other family would be there every single week, without exception. That creates a strong family unit. There are new family units, and perhaps this could have been a byline, if I may say. I have many problems with the internet. One thing it has done, we have a site, a Facebook page and a WhatsApp, Families Forever, strangely made up of family members. I am less active in the Facebook site than others. I spread family news to people who already know it, even though it's immediate, because it's been posted, and everyone, apart from me, been a little too elderly to master these things too often, perhaps culturally so, more than technically so, knows about it. And that has strengthened the family units across distance. But I would put it to the reporters and to government that if any government is going to be truly pro-family, then the rented housing sector has to fundamentally change to offer that choice, so that, be it in the small rural village, in the mining community, in the city, people have the option to live near family. Because that is what is really creating the dysfunctionality. Units can always be dysfunctional, and have been, and will be. Households will be. But families can overcome much of that, in particular the protecting of children, if there are people available. The way of work these days is making that significantly more difficult. And the final end point I'll make has been referenced by others, but then when we look at the older end, by the day, more of interest to me to think about. What does one do with the elderly family? Well, again, how we structure housing and accommodation is absolutely fundamental to that. We don't make it easy. We don't incentivise, and that's within our powers. My plea to decision makers is to take this report as a useful prompt and assist into thinking through the how. There will be others, but I think housing is the number one where we could make a change that would make a difference, that would support families.
Marriage is a vital social institution. The exclusive commitment of 2 individuals to each other nurtures love and mutual support. It brings stability to our society. For those that choose to marry and for their children, marriage provides an abundance of legal, financial and social benefits. In return, it imposes weighty legal, financial and social obligations. My Lords, these are not my words, but those of Chief Justice Marshall, delivering the judgment of the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 2003, the case that decided that same-sex marriage should be lawful in the first state in the United States. The words are so powerful that they are often read out at the weddings of opposite and same-sex couples, and I am proud to have read them at the wedding of a close friend. We stood on a beach on the west coast of California, and as the ceremony progressed, it became clear that the tide was racing in. But in the case of this reform, the tide of public opinion is moving in only one direction. In 2003, when that case was decided, there was only 50% public support in Massachusetts for same-sex marriage. In December last year, that number had risen to 83%. And my lords, we all know that opinion poll approval ratings of any issue are very rarely that high. That has been the experience of this reform worldwide. Same-sex marriage is now permitted in 35 countries, covering the population of 1.4 billion people, 17% of the world's people. On January the 1st, Estonia will become the 36th country. Perhaps the arc of the moral universe does, in this case, bend towards justice. Of course, in England and Wales, this reform has now been in place for a decade. I'm very proud to have played a part in that, having set up the Freedom to Marry campaign and voted for the change in the House of Commons. In the 14 years that I was a Member of Parliament, there were very few occasions on which the votes I cast pleased my constituents. Indeed, much of the time, my voting made my constituents furious or unhappy as we sought to tax them or regulate them or restrict their lives in some way. The only effect of this vote, was to create happiness and joy. And the vote did no harm to anyone else. And as the years have gone by, the arguments against the change have fallen away. I don't seek to relitigate those arguments today. And I noted what my noble friend, Baroness Stoll, said about the members of Parliament who voted against the change. Some of them in good conscience, others because they were fearful of the reaction of their constituency activists. Those that were in the last camp, many of them have since expressed their regret and apology, including informal statements in the House of Commons for the decisions they took. They found themselves unwelcome at the weddings of friends or the children of friends. They found themselves facing difficulty in their own conscience about going to those events when they sought to prevent them from taking place. I was very grateful to have been able, thanks to the decision of Tony Blair's government, but with the support of the Conservative front bench, to introduce civil partnerships. It was one of the most important things that I have done in my life. I remember mentioning, I thought only in passing, to my then partner, now husband, that it might be a good idea, since this legislation had been introduced, if we were to consider entering a civil partnership. I forgot, of course, that he was a lawyer, and that evening the forms that one had to fill in to apply for a civil partnership had been complete with the yellow post-it notes where I was required to sign and placed by the bedside table. For a while, I thought that entering into the civil partnership was enough. It conferred, after all the legal rights and entitlements of a marriage. And I came to realize that it was not. And as we advanced the arguments for this change, I saw how important the institution of marriage was. And it is one of the joys of the legislation that it creates the legal fiction that a couple who entered into a civil partnership and then changed that to a marriage are deemed to have been married from the date of their civil partnership. That in itself expresses the importance of the change. In 2018, there were 6,700 same-sex marriages in England and Wales. That's something like 3% of the total number. That might seem a low number, but it's of immense importance to the individuals concerned. And significantly, it's a number that's now 6 or 7 times the number of civil partnerships. As the institution of civil marriage became available to same-sex couples, their choice was not to enter overwhelmingly civil partnerships, but to enter into marriage. That says something about the enduring importance of the institution in the eyes of a section of society. The report notes that in 2019, religious ceremonies accounted for less than 1 in 5 opposite-sex marriages, and that is a sharp decrease from the year before. But it also notes that 0.7% of marriages in that year were to same-sex couples, that is 0.7% that were conducted in a religious institution. There is, of course, a fundamental difference. Religious marriage is in decline by choice, and I regret that, and I have no doubt that most noble lords will regret that too. But the number of same-sex religious marriages is so low, not by choice, but because the individuals are forbidden by our established church from getting married in their institutions. That is a decision of the established church that, while I disagree with, I wholly respect. It seems to me, as my noble friend Baroness Stoll said, that religious freedom is absolutely fundamental and is enshrined in the legislation that introduced same-sex marriage, that it should be a matter for each church denomination to decide what is appropriate for them to do. I note that the United Reformed Church, the Methodist Church of Great Britain and the Church of Scotland have all decided that they will introduce same-sex marriages, and that the Church of England Synod decided narrowly that it would bless same-sex marriages from the 1st of January. I don't underestimate how difficult that debate has been, but I do think that that is an important step in the right direction. The Most Reverend and the Noble Primate said in his speech that families come in all shapes and sizes and that they are not simply nuclear. And of course today that is simply true. But there are devout same-sex couples who want no more than that their marriage should be consecrated in church. My lords, it's refreshing to be debating love when so much of today's news seems to be about hate. And we do see a tale of two worlds. One world, the world I described, where human rights are flourishing and where progress towards important reforms is happening. But we see another world too, another world where human rights are not only not moving forward, but are going backwards. And no more so than in Uganda, which recently became a country to pass what can only be described as the most hateful legislation, discriminating against lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. Indeed, arguably the most discriminatory and repressive legislation introduced by any democratic country, creating indeed the death penalty for aggravated offences. What is extraordinary is that the Bishop of Uganda said that he was grateful for that anti-homosexuality act. And I congratulate the Most Reverend and Noble Prelate, who very clearly rebuked the bishop. He called on international bodies that represent conservative churches to make explicitly and publicly clear that the criminalisation of LGBTQ people is something that no Anglican province can support, and that must be stated unequivocally. I appreciate the concerns that leaders of the Anglican Church have about schism. But, my lords, these laws are nothing less than hateful. And I'm afraid it is true that many of them are being driven by religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalism not just in Islam, but also, I am afraid, in some elements of the Christian church. No religious leader would want to feel that they are on the right side of history, but rather I suggest that they will want to be on the right side of what is becoming an increasingly stark moral divide. As the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on LGBT rights, I have the great privilege of travelling the world, and when I visit countries, the first meetings that I ask to hold are always with the activists, sometimes very brave people in those countries who are campaigning for nothing more than the same rights that we enjoy in our country. In one such meeting a few months ago, I was joined at his own expense by my husband. As is usual in these situations, we went around the room introducing ourselves. And when it came to my husband's turn, he said that he was my husband. And with that, one of the activists burst into tears. Simply because, for him, the idea that somebody could be themselves, could enter into not just a union, but a marriage of his same-sex partner, was so profound, so out of reach for that individual in their country, that it expressed something immensely important to him, so important that it moved him to tears. And marriage is a public statement as well as a private commitment. And that's why the reform of same-sex marriage mattered so much. The commission which set up this report asked, how can we support every family to flourish? What kind of society do we want to live in? And my lords, I think that is the right question. It was one that was answered by another Chief Justice, the Chief Justice of the United States, delivering the judgment of Obergefell in 2015 that said that same-sex marriage was lawful throughout the United States. And my lords, I hope you will forgive me for quoting a very short piece of that judgment at the end of my remarks. No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right.
My Lords, the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, hereinafter to be referred to simply as the Archbishop, with his permission, is to be congratulated on securing this debate and allowing us to explore the different aspects of this very important report that we've all had time now to read. I found myself, I have to say, initially thinking this is such a statement of what we must surely all want, that it felt that it lacked a bit of grit and a little bit of kind of edge. I got to the two chapters, one about the child matters and the other about the life we live, where some of that was corrected and I was able to form a more rounded judgment of the report as a whole. Now, noble lords have already covered much of the ground that I had sought to establish in my remarks, and I will observe the strict self-discipline of not going where others have already trodden. I will also endeavour not to fulfil the stereotype of the Methodist preacher who preaches very long sermons, in the hope that I may not speak for quite as long as one or two who've spoken already. Time will tell. Time will tell. The Archbishop has made ample reference to the Beveridge report and its provisions, and quite rightly too. A pub quiz question which I put to many people in Parliament and at other places is, if the welfare state consists of the implementation of the recommendations of Beveridge and covers 6 areas of our national life, with perhaps the Butler Education Act at its beginning and the Health Act at its end, who can name the other 4? And who can name the person who directed them through our Parliament? And it's a question that stymies most people. And I can see bewilderment on the bishops' faces even now. Oh, no, the Archbishop and I will talk about it later. But the person who put 4 Acts of Parliament on the statute book was Jim Griffiths, who was our Member of Parliament in Llanelli, who lived in Buryport, where I come from, who'd begun his life in the mines and worked his way up to be head of the South Wales Federation of Miners, went to the Miners' College in London, long before he entered politics, because he only thought he had something to say once he'd done all that, and then showed the most humane way, leading a debate here in this House, because at that time the Commons were sitting here, daring to ask the government in time of war to debate the provisions of the Beveridge Act in March 1943 and to promise to undertake to implement its provisions once the war was over. I'm very proud to come from a stable that produced such a man. Let me just give one little illustration from my early life where those considerations played a very real part. I was raised in a single-parent family. Like the Archbishop, I discovered late in life that the man I thought was my father wasn't my father. But for all that, we were thrown out of the family home, my mother and 2 boys, and we lived in one room, a lean-to, in a brickyard. And if it weren't for school meals, I wouldn't have eaten meat until I was well into my teens. But the incident I wish to recount, because of its illustrative value, is the visit of a man from the National Assistance Board, or I should have said National Assistance, Family Allowances, Injuries at Work, and National Insurance. Those were the 4 acts we're talking about. But we were visited by a man with a briefcase and wearing a suit into our humble little abode, who wanted to question my mother as to whether she was entitled to benefits. She had suffered irreversible injuries carrying sheets of steel from one part of a tin plating process to another in the local factory until it broke her body, and she couldn't barely stand after that. But the questioning of this man of my poor mother as to whether she was entitled, whether she shouldn't really make herself fit for work, was what a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old boy couldn't tolerate any longer. With a wink between us, me and my brother, we set upon that man, we hit him, beat him, and threw him out of the home. And it has remained. It satisfied all my pugilistic needs for the rest of my life. The antidote is still being played out. But for all of that, I learned what threatens families from the side of officialdom. Again and again and again, through my ministry, I have stood by claimants in offices that purport to be there to help them along, where frankly the atmosphere is fetid and the humiliation of the person making an application is total. That's what it did to my mother. And I have learned that sweet talk about families, even when they seek to be good families, is sometimes threatened by external forces and systemic forces, imposed very often, of course, by people like us sitting in places like this. Well, that was the first thing, and that was a bit of grit that was stimulated by my reading of this report. We fast forward a little now to my time as a minister in Essex, and on Friday evening it was my job as an officer in the boys' brigade to look after what are called the anchor boys. They're the tiny tots, between 5 and 7. And so every Friday, between 5 and 7, there I was. But I soon became aware of something transactional that was happening in those sessions. The mothers of the children would bring the boys, but the fathers would fetch them. It was considered to be a safe place in broken families where the children living at home during the week with their mothers could be handed over to their fathers. And therefore, in days when the church has suffered more than most from all the stuff to do with safeguarding over the years, it was a marvelous thing to have that trust placed in one. But it also made me aware of the pressures under which families live, the pressures under which families are broken. It's true that the housing shortage that we are currently going through was not, even in those post-war years, the problem it is today. How can even the highest-minded parent bring up children in the squalid conditions and under the inhumane provisions that are currently in force? So I learned lessons about the pressures on families that way. And finally, to fulfill my self-fulfilling prophecy here, mention has been made of long marriages. I had 56, I had 54. Well, we're 55. Yes, the same woman. We had 3 children, and we had the happiest of times with them. The boys were born in Haiti, with Haitian doctors and nurses, and in a Haitian hospital with Haitian people in a similar condition alongside them. We had a fabulous time. All my 3 children can tell you the French word for a Jerusalem artichoke, and all of them can sing the Welsh national anthem. But curiously, despite all that was positive, 2 of my 3 children are in their second marriages. Now, I won't recount chapter and verse, but I will say that in the best of circumstances, to the best of people with happy memories, bad things happen. And so it's important in looking at the family and recognizing that it matters, and the place of love in helping to form the cement for that. It's important for us never to forget that there, but for the grace of God, go any one of us, And from one moment to another, things happen, and we must therefore not feel that even the worthiest of recommendations we can produce will solve the problems we face easily. A Methodist minister at 10.5 minutes sits down and hopes to be commended for it.
My lords, I should try and do even better than 10 minutes. I am grateful to my most reverend friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury, for putting forward this motion. And I'd like to focus my remarks on families and children in relation to the criminal justice system, and particularly imprisonment. And I declare an interest as Anglican Bishop for prisons in England and Wales. Jesus Christ once placed a child front and centre as he taught his listeners. And I want to use that image simply to pose the idea that we would navigate things differently. We would see different sort of manifestos committed to the long term and make better policies if the child is always the central focus and starting point for all our policy making. It seems that so much of government policy is focused on short-term fixing for the now or a few years' time. But what would it look like if policy and legislation was shaped in response to the child born today into a network of relationships and then their life as an adult 20 or 30 years' time? This means investing more intentionally in the early years and family life. And I say that as someone who was once a paediatric speech and language therapist with training in family therapy. We need a systemic approach with a long-term view. Data published by the Ministry of Justice shows that 57% of adult prisoners have literacy levels below that of an 11-year-old. 57%. And we know that 42% of prisoners were expelled or excluded from school. What is going wrong upstream, not least in families, that leads to these statistics? Although not linear, research has shown how important it is to be aware of adverse childhood experiences when considering the causes of offending. As you've heard me say many times, prison costs between £50,000 and £60,000 per person per year. And then add on to that the social and economic cost of reoffending, estimated at 18 billion per annum. Much of this could be spent upstream, focusing on the multiple layers underlying the causes of crime, not least with a focus on early years, the child and the family. But looking at those who are in prison, we should be focusing on rehabilitation with relationship at its heart. At present, over 50% of those serving a sentence of under a year go on to reoffend. This is not good for offenders, victims, families and communities. Focusing resources on addressing homelessness, addiction, purposeful work is vital to reducing reoffending, and front and centre is the importance of stable and affirming relationships. I find it very interesting to discover that people in Dutch prisons work on their reintegration from day one of their sentence, which includes having to work at a focus on their social networks. And this connects to the noble Lord Farmer's significant reviews on family ties. Prisoners visited by family or a partner are 39% less likely to commit another crime. If sentencing focused on the child and the family, we would make stronger use of community sentencing and other options for non-violent offenders. And that would include ways of strengthening social networks and healthy family ties. It would also mean, I believe, that we would change our policy on sending pregnant women to prison, not least given the stats around stillbirth, premature birth, and even death. Where is the focus on the child? And then there are all those children and households who are impacted by parental imprisonment. My lords, it's estimated that over 300,000 children have a parent in prison. But we don't know the exact number because there's no statutory way of recording these children or even knowing where they are. As the prison population continues to rise, so too the number of children and families impacted. And parental imprisonment is recognised as one of those adverse childhood experiences, which contributes to long-term health and social problems. There is an excellent recent film produced by the charity Children Heard and Seen, and it highlights horrifically the impact on a child when the parent is in prison. It ranges from reduced educational achievement and mental and physical well-being through to losing your home and your school. Perhaps it's good to be reminded that almost 25% of the adult prison population have previously been in care, and nearly half of under 21-year-olds in contact with the criminal justice system have spent time in care. No child should be punished as a result of their parents offending. Early interventions by charities like Children Heard and Seen needs to be mainstreamed, and we need statutory provision in order to identify these children to ensure appropriate support for long-term good for everyone. And I was very pleased to hear the noble lady Baroness Butler-Schloss talk about the importance of listening to children to stop those intergenerational cycles of offending and reoffending. What we are doing is not good for families, for communities, for victims and offenders who are part of those families and communities. Unsurprisingly, recent research by Prisoner Action Care Trust, PACT, found that prisoner families are affected emotionally and financially. This might include losing a household income, as well as the cost of simply visiting someone in prison. And of course, the bigger picture, as I've just said, includes the children, young people, families and communities impacted by crime. All of this is making for more fracturing communities, and I believe is conveying a subconscious message that love and relationship does not really matter. The public narrative, shaped by media headlines, is that we need to be tougher on crime, and that equates to locking more people up and for longer to make our streets safer and our communities stronger. It is not true, and it's not supported by data or evidence. Actually, I think what we're doing is a soft option, particularly when there's not a focus on rehabilitation and meaningful relationships when people are in prison. How often do we even hear the word love when it comes to criminal justice? We are not serving, let me say again, offenders, victims, families or communities well. The tough option would be to look systemically at what we are doing, to ask what prisons are for, to put the child one day to be an adult front and centre, and ask what we hope our interventions are really going to achieve long term, and to name love. And if we agree with the Archbishop's Commission that loving families are central to the well-being of adults and children living in all types of household, then I believe we need to be asking what this means for reform in our criminal justice system.
Could I add my congratulations to the Commission? It's an interesting and very detailed report. I won't say I've read every word of the 238 pages, but I have read it, and it's worth reading. I don't agree with every word either. My particular question would be, I'm very sceptical about government interference, perhaps in a slightly different way to the noble Lord Griffiths. I'm not involved in pugilistically admonishing civil servants. However, I don't think government interference in personal lives is necessarily a good thing. It can be, but I think we should be very cautious about it. I also very much enjoyed, as always, listening to the Most Reverend Primate.
It'll do.
Okay. The Most Reverend Primate. It saves me travelling to Canterbury to listen to his Sunday sermons, and we get some, or wherever he gives them, but they're very good sermons anyway. I was interested in the report, and for instance, learning about hookup culture. I'd never heard of it before, but I got the gist pretty quickly, I think. My Lords, love matters. I was brought up on the authorised version, faith, hope and charity. Now, charity faileth not. I'm not a Greek scholar, so it may be that St. Paul actually meant love, but I think love can be a rather debased word in our society. Anyway, we'll stick with love matters. In the report, there's a lot of talk of other religions, and every child matters in chapter 6, and singleness, and it's all good stuff. I was single until I was 40, so over half my life, so I agree with that too. And of course, listening to children. But what I'd like to turn to is actually what was not said in the report. And here I follow my noble friend Baroness Stoll, who said with much greater clarity than I am going to express it. The Good Childhood reports produced by the Children's Society, which I think used to be the Church of England Children's Society. Still is, but it doesn't call itself that. Has in the past highlighted, and I think it's about a decade, they actually studied how children want to be with both parents. I think they came out with something like 80% of children asked said they want to be with both parents. And on page 77 of the report, it says 44% of children did not live with both parents up to the age of 17. This is the Love Matters report. The report also tells us that, I quote, 50% of children in poverty live in single-parent households. Well, might I say, only connects. There's a correlation here. I used to go to magistrates' courts quite often, and all too often, sadly, the defending counsel would say, poor Johnny came from a broken home, as we used to call them. I don't know if that's the same case, but not everyone, of course, but actually that's an understanding that coming from a home where you don't have both parents is not the best solution. And 76% of young men in prison, according to the Prison Reform Trust, again, this is a few years ago, in prison in England and Wales, had absent fathers. So what is missing from the report? Well, I would suggest two things, and that's not to undermine the people who've put on a great deal of hard work on this. First, upholding marriage, as my noble friend Baroness Stoll said. There's lots of people in all sorts of diverse relationships who bring up children brilliantly. But marriage is the best. And I have to say, I think the Church of England should say that. And indeed, my noble friend Lord Herbert made a very moving contribution, quoting from a Supreme Court judge in the US about marriage. If you're brought up by a married family, you have a 4 times better chance of living with both parents until the age of 18 as those that are not brought up by married families. And the second point I'd like to make is there's no mention of responsibility, especially the responsibilities of men, the responsibility of fathers, in a relationship that lasts 1 week, 2 years, 10 years, but it's all too often fathers, men, that walk out, leaving mothers literally holding the baby. And there's no mention in the report of the reasons for overcrowding. Now, often this is because families have more children, perhaps for cultural reasons, than our houses are designed to cope with. Our houses are not built to have 6 or 8 children in them. And I have to say, it's the same with child poverty. Most people restrict the number of children they have to those that they can afford. But if you have 6 or 8 children, it becomes very different. Now, the Most Reverend Primate, in his exit speech, when he got into politics, I started to differ with him. I have to say I'm not surprised, because I know 98% of votes cast by bishops in this session have been against government policy. It might be a surprise to the huge number of Conservatives that go to the church. But the leader of my church thinks there is a moral case for removing the 2-child limit in benefits. Well, I think he could make that moral case to the majority of people who responsibly choose to restrict the size of their families to the number of children they can afford. I don't think that's in any way a a difficult concept. Most people will restrict the size of their families. The report also talks about abuse in families. Now, actually, again, if one goes to court, one will discover that abuse in families is very often, typically a man, but not always, typically a man that is not married to his partner who beats her up. Of course, there's a lot of abuse in married families as well. So what I would say to, if I might, is yes, be more forgiving. Yes, be understanding. But I think we all of us, have to be held responsible for our actions and the consequences of them. And above all, I go back to my first point, which is that the Church of England should stand up for what may be considered old-fashioned values of individual responsibility, and above all, that marriage is best. So please, I say to my church, say so. Otherwise, to refer to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, I'm afraid the trumpet is giving an uncertain sound.
My Lords, I wish also to thank my most reverend friends, the Archbishop of Canterbury, for securing this important debate. Love Matters is, as noble lords have already remarked, impressive for its scale and its breadth, covering subjects from tackling child poverty through to valuing single people in our churches. The report is able to draw some creative links across a range of topics. Today, however, given my role as the lead bishop for housing in the Church of England, I want to focus my remarks on the report's findings on bricks, mortar, and the communities that well-designed, affordable housing can foster. It is in houses and flats that families and households of different shapes and sizes are built, and housing which, done right, creates homes and can enable the health and prosperity of those who live in them. And I want here to thank, in particular, the Noble Lord Mann for his valuable contribution on housing-related issues in this debate already. Noble Lords will know that this report is the last in a series of 3. The first, published in 2021, was on the work for which I'm now responsible, housing, church and community. I can't take any credit for the report itself, but I'm delighted now to be involved in that work. And the report to which the Archbishop of Canterbury has already referred was called Coming Home. And it recommended, among other things, that housing needed to be stable, to be affordable, to be high quality, to enable people to put down roots and build healthy lives, families and neighbourhoods. I think that the principle of stability goes to the heart of what I want to contribute to today's debate. And again, stable is a word too that the Archbishop of Canterbury used several times in his opening remarks. For too many people, housing is not stable. It is unaffordable. It is not decent. The tenure is insecure, and thus it is not a long-term home, but a temporary base where it's impossible to put down roots. Such housing is no foundation for strong families and households. By contrast, where there is high-quality, affordable housing, it's much easier to find secure, healthy, and happy families. My Lords, let me make 4 points, if I may, on stable housing to underscore this point. Firstly, stable housing is healthy housing. Poor quality housing, indicated by damp, mould, poor insulation and heating, unsafe installations, lack of natural light and overcrowding, can and does affect the health and well-being of its occupants, both mental and physical health. And poor health has knock-on effects for families, lower educational outcomes, for example, or higher caring costs, and in particular for children, as we've heard, who we know are all too often at the sharp end of the poor health outcomes caused by low-quality housing. The cost to the NHS of treating people whose health has been impacted by poor housing conditions is estimated at £1.4 billion per year. Unhealthy homes are a widespread and serious barrier to the creation of stable, healthy households and families.
And looking back to the peak of the pandemic, as Love Matters does, we can see that housing inequality can be a driving force behind health inequality. So I reiterate the call made by my most reverend friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that high-quality homes, and especially social housing, where the government can have a particular hand in improving standards, should be placed at the centre of manifesto pledges ahead of the next election. And secondly, my lords, stable housing is affordable housing. To make starting a family viable for many young couples, particularly in areas including London and the South East, where housing costs are high, genuine affordability must also be considered. If, as for many young couples, even on a dual income, the only financially viable option is a one-bedroom flat with little space and scant disposable income, then couples who do wish to start a family may have no choice but to delay. At the other end of the life of a relationship, the stresses and strains of managing finances are one of the biggest contributing factors to relationship breakdowns. Where housing eats up a large slice of a household's income, extra pressure is piled on at every stage. Housing affordability is not an abstract concept over which we have little control. There are steps that the government can take in the here and now to relieve this particular pressure on households. In the autumn statement, the Chancellor made the welcome and long overdue announcement that the local housing allowance would be unfrozen and brought back in line with its former level, covering the lowest 30% of local rents in a given area. While I warmly welcome the change, it's also vital that it comes into effect as soon as possible to provide a lifeline for those struggling to afford housing costs, rather than waiting until April, as is currently proposed. Winter is the toughest time for families and households to make ends meet. The vision of the Love Matters report for a society where families are strong, healthy and happy will simply not be possible if the support available for those on the lowest incomes doesn't cover the basics. I wonder then, will the government look again at the timing of the change to LHA to promote healthy, strong homes over the coming winter months? Thirdly, my lords, stable housing is for the long term. Earlier this year, figures from the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities showed that record numbers of households were stuck in temporary accommodation. Over 100,000 households between January and March, with over 130,000 dependent children. For refugee families, the move-on period from temporary accommodation when an asylum claim has been granted can in practice be little more than a couple of weeks. How are young refugee families looking to set down roots in the UK, often after a drawn-out and traumatic experience, how are they supposed to feel that they can begin building a settled home? My lords, we all want to see stronger families and households, but without a commitment to long-term housing options, it's not clear how this can practically be achieved. And fourthly, stable housing is tailored to the needs of its occupants. And here I'm grateful to the noble Lord Davies of Brixton for drawing attention to this matter. Not every household or family will fit one of the familiar flats or homes most common to our cities, towns and villages. We need to see more intergenerational family homes built, where grandparents can live alongside their children and grandchildren, each able to support the other and maintain a level of independence. Such housing should take into account the family in all its fullness, including uncles, aunts, cousins, and neighbours who are like family to us, but are not usually considered in the setting of family policy. There are numerous benefits to building this kind of housing. Lower combined housing costs, childcare readily available from grandparents, reduced loneliness, and lower care costs, to name just a few. We know that we need to build more houses, but I'd like to take this opportunity to call on local authorities and those involved in commissioning new projects to look creatively at the breadth of housing offered. As the Church of England, we're committed to leading by example. And as Bishop for Housing, I'm overseeing the work to change the way the Church thinks about and manages its land and property assets. Our goal is to build many more stable homes for families who desperately need good housing in our villages, towns and cities. However, I have to say that I'm disappointed that it's taking us so long to develop this work. We still have much to do to agree and implement a whole church approach to using our assets for the common good. We have made some real progress, but there's so much more to do to make the really significant impact on the housing crisis which was envisioned in the Coming Home report and is possible. My Lords, I want to end by reiterating the words of Love Matters. Housing is more than bricks and mortar. It is where we should all feel safe. Stable housing is healthy, affordable and appropriate, and one of the most fundamental building blocks of happy and healthy families. We might get some way to achieving the vision set out in the Archbishop's Commission on Families and Households by robust and creative investment in this fundamental building block.
It's a very great pleasure to follow the noble Bishop in that splendid speech. Housing, of course, is fundamental to decent family life, and she's right to make those points. I'd like to add my congratulations to the Most Reverend Primate of all England for the choosing this debate and the manner in which he introduced it. It really is entirely appropriate to have a Christmas debate focused on the family. The season which, above all, is focused on the most famous family that ever lived. And it's a privilege to be able to take part in this debate. And I want to choose my words with real care, because I so agreed with my noble friend Baroness Stowell when she focused in her speech on marriage. Like the noble Lord, my friend Lord Griffiths of Bury Port also had a long marriage to a single wife, 56 years in my case. What I'm even more pleased about is the fact that both of my sons have celebrated silver weddings, and one is heading for his 30th next year, which is very good. And the family is the fundamental building block of society, and strong marriages make for strong families. My noble friend Lord Herbert made a powerful and a moving speech. I have to say, and he indicated that he respected the views of those who take a different view, that whilst I have, and I'm proud to have, many gay friends whom I like and admire enormously, to me, I hold to the traditional Christian view that marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, I know there are many Christians who don't agree with that, and I respect them, and perhaps I am wrong, but I do hold to that view, and I think it's extremely important that we do all we can within the Christian Church to encourage marriage, because there is a stability in that relationship which is not present in others. I do support what the General Synod decided a couple of weeks ago. I'm sorry the majority was such a narrow one, because I think it is right that those of the same sex who wish to live together as a permanent couple should have an opportunity for a blessing in church. And so I welcome that and support it and will continue to do so. And I have every sympathy with the Most Reverend Primate, who does have, in seeking to lead the Anglican Communion, a very, very difficult task indeed. And he deserves the support and the prayers of us all. Because what my noble friend Lord Herbert said about Uganda is frankly toe-curling. And nobody could conceivably, no Christian really could, I don't see how any Christian can give support to a regime that will punish with a death sentence people who follow particular inclinations in their life. And it's so he has my complete support in what the hard work he's seeking to do there. My Lords, it's appropriate to turn to the role of government. And if government, and I agree with my noble friend Lord Robertson, who made the point that he didn't put it in these words, but he was not a supporter of the nanny state. Well, nor am I. But I do think government has a real task to encourage family life. Yeah. It has a real task in doing all it can, touching on the point made by the Bishop of Chelmsford, to ensure that there is proper housing available. Difficult to hold a family together if they have to live in the sort of conditions that Lord Griffiths of Berryport so movingly described in his speech. But there is another thing that I would like to see government do, and that is to encourage young people. And after all, if we don't treat our children properly, we're sabotaging our own future. And I'm one of those who believes that there is a real virtue in a civil national service for young people who reach the age of 18. I'm not suggesting it has to be full-time. It can be in conjunction with university or other studies or occupations. But I think there is real value in giving young people, or encouraging in young people, a sense of civic and national pride and patriotism, I use the word deliberately, by obliging them to perform certain tasks of a civil nature. The National Trust encourages this, and I think it's very good that it should. But I think it should be really for every young person to have that opportunity, and it should be underwritten, in my view, by government funding, whichever party is in power. I'm one of those who just escaped national service. I was old enough and had it deferred, because in those days, if you went to university, it was virtually automatically deferred until you got your degree. And by the time I had graduated in 1960 or 61, it was all over. And I rather regret that, but nevertheless, there we are. And I do think that there is a great, great deal to be said for a form of national civil service for our young people. I think it would chime with many of the recommendations that are made in this hefty and lengthy report, on which I congratulate the two archbishops and all those responsible for it, and again thank the Archbishop for giving us the opportunity of debating this morning in your Lordship's house.
Break in just before he sits down to say that I didn't avoid national service, that I did my 2 years, and there's much that he has said in truth about it. But having listened to the whole of this debate, the emphasis surely should not be on marriage. We understand entirely why the noble Lord Herbert of South Downs feels so strongly about marriage, but the centre point is the family and the household.
My Lords, a debate like this is an odd one, because going through it, you suddenly realise just the great reach of the Church of England. It's a big institution. It has done many things which are good, some one or two things which you might disagree with, but you can't deny its reach and its power. Also, any report which gives recommendations to itself to change in greater number than government, I feel probably does deserve some attention by everybody going there. They haven't said their own house is correct. Possibly that gets you a hearing, at least from me, when it comes to the process going through. And also the emphasis on family. My Lords, anybody who has done anything in many of the fields which the Church is involved in knows that as a delivery structure or a campaigning organisation round, and this report is mainly about children. I did rather enjoy Lord Davis, his thrust and the counter and parry by the Prince Bishop of Durham, if I've got it right, was actually one of the little things I enjoyed on this. Fair enough. Age wasn't mentioned, but fair enough it had been mentioned somewhere else. It was something going through, but talking about family and children, particularly children, those children who have problems who get through them usually have the family behind them. They have an immediate support structure that knows what is going on, recognise it, and campaigns. Now, it's now time to declare my interests. I'm president of the British Dyslexia Association. I'm dyslexic. I am chairman of an assistive technology company. My experience of dealing with a group who struggle with the education system, that is the thing that gives you the building block to access other bits of life, is very solidly wrapped up in the principle and the rather black humour joke, which I've used too often, but I'm afraid is still relevant. To be a successful disabled child, choose your parents carefully. Once you have that support structure, you stand a chance going forward. And my Lords, those parents, wherever they come from, and just another little aside, the Baroness Stoll's first comments about when we put gay marriage through here, I was slightly disappointed about that process because she managed it so well. I was expecting a good fight, and we didn't really get one. So well done there, and my noble friend, the Baroness Featherstone, who actually initiated it in the Commons, I think feels the same way. Sort of, oh, it's gone through, no problem. It was a masterstroke of strategy. Possibly, to use a rugby analogy, you had very good ball in space and used it well. So congratulations. I'll explain later, don't worry. If we're to go back to the points about that, any family unit, no matter how it's constructed, is needed there to support the child. And when you don't get that interest and that support, because the family isn't functioning, it becomes massively difficult. We've heard about the prison population. Most of the people in prisons are educational failures. I don't know the figures the noble bishop. Yes, let's get it right. I'm sorry, I'm sort of sitting down here. I don't know whether it's a flock or a pack of bishops we're dealing with today, but there are many. There's just been suggested a coven behind me. I think that's got to be wrong.
Keep digging.
Anyway, as we go through, every time you look at the people with problems, it's because they probably haven't had a family that can do something for them. So, what is needed? What is needed here, and the government talks about this dots around the edges, is someone who can intervene early enough to support that family, that parent, that group, or take it on and be successful. But even with the best will in the world, some people who are the heads of families, the carers, will not be able to do it, usually because they either lack educational attainment and understand the system themselves, very often, or they are so stressed by other problems, poverty, bad housing, that they are in not a position to actually go and dig and find out, because the day-to-day realities of keeping a roof over your head or putting enough food on the table overwhelm you. And it's just something that actually goes together. So, my lords, making sure, and the noble Lord Griffiths, who has of course slipped out the minute I tried to refer to him, pointed out, and historically, if you don't give people what they are entitled to, and the amount of unclaimed benefit has always been something which has absolutely astounded me. Usually because people don't know they can get it, or feel guilty about taking it. In the various places, we don't, let's face it, we don't give a lot, that much away that easily. If it's there for a recognised reason. Making sure that that is attainable will help the family and get the background to create. The second thing I would like to do, to go totally towards my own end of the sandpit when it comes to education, that is special educational needs, is making sure that it isn't the parent's job to get a diagnosis, campaign to get through, getting the plan or something else, and making sure it is the school's job to do more. And the way you'll do that, my lords, is you will make sure there is better awareness and the capacity to handle different learning patterns caused by conditions such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autism, within the mainstream school. Because they're there. We have 80% non-recognition in certain age groups of dyslexia. 80%, that's just one condition. And they usually hunt in packs, by the way. ADHD often accompanies dyslexia and autism and all the rest of them. And also, my lords, we're not talking often about those people with the most obvious need. We're talking about the person who is failing consistently, or just failing, or just passing at such a huge effort of extra concentration that they will not maintain it for very long, or will jump out early. And, my lords, if I am due to be hosting a meeting of the British Dyslexia Police Association, which has dozens of examples of people who've gone through exactly that journey. And that's our police force. Think how many didn't make it. Basically, their client base. So, my lords, if we are going to do this and look at the structure and looking at help, making sure that this group, which are basically the failures, and alternative provision within education. My lords, the government have recently said, yes, we accept virtually everybody in this, something which has grown over the years. My lords, I will give you my 30-minute diatribe on why academisation wasn't any good at some other point. Why that group that is there and growing, everybody in there has a special educational need. Most of them are unidentified. They have to now have an extra capacity to identify. If you are going to allow families to have their best option and get the best results out of them, don't expect them all to be wonderful tiger parents. Allow them to be an ordinary parent doing their best job. Make sure the rest of the system comes in and helps. If you expect people to be wonderful, occasionally you'll get the lucky and the brilliant will get through. But that is a definition of a failed system. Absolutely a failed system. Can the Minister, when he replies, hopefully give some hint as to how a better integrated policy for taking this bit off the pressure of parents is going to be developed? How are we going to make sure you don't have to find a £600 assessment or pay for it yourself to get a child identified with the right help? And just to finish on this, and I've already gone on slightly longer than I hoped to, I've just had a recent piece of work from the LSE, from a Dr. Tanny Campbell, which points out that in more deprived areas you have more people identified as having, educational problems, but far fewer identified as actually having specific problems. Now, all of the conditions I've talked about, you don't need to work harder, you need to work smarter, because your brain is not accepting information in the way others do, thus it can't give it out. Dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia, all of them, ADHD, all of them, they share this. They're not the same, but they're all there. So, my lords, what development has been taken to take this bit of strain off a family and the carers there? It ties in with everything else, it's part of the picture. But at the moment, there's still some truth in the stereotype that dyslexia, for instance, is the middle-class disease. Little Johnny, who's a complete swine in the classroom, we can use stronger language if we like. For the middle class, he's got ADHD, but if he comes from more traditional working class backgrounds or the non-exam passing class, he's just a swine. The girl who doesn't get recognised because her coping strategy is to disappear in the middle of the class, she doesn't get any help at all. What is the government doing about making sure this entire sector is better at recognising this group? Because, my lords, writing off 20% of our population in their educational process under normal circumstances is surely something which should have gone a long time ago.
Yeah. My Lords, I'd like to declare an interest as Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience in London and to thank the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Right Reverend Prelate, the Archbishop of York, for commissioning the report Love Matters, and the Most Reverend Primate for choosing this as the subject for his annual debate. I've learnt a lot during the course of the debate, including many personal recollections and perspectives of many of my noble lords. I would echo the noble Lord Addington's point on the reach of the Church of England and the approach they have taken in making recommendations to themselves as well as the government, and I look forward to the noble Viscount's response to the questions that are directed at the government, both in the report and in the course of this debate. The Right Reverend Primate presented families as being the original social unit, predating what we now view as society, and it's worth remembering that. It would be hard to disagree with his view that families and households of all types, including those made up of friendship bonds, have a value and should be supported. In the spirit of not quite quoting Larkin, it is also true that families are not always ideal and should not be idealised. I agreed with my noble friend Lord Davies that those without faith also have a view on these issues and a voice that is vital. Like the noble Lord Rowbotham, I remained single until my 40s. However, I think this is where our shared view ends, and I'm afraid I disagreed with most of what he said. Like Lord Davies, however, I recognise frustration over use of the terms used by policymakers such as family-friendly, and would add my own pet hate of the use of the phrase as a mother to justify a political point of view where one could replace this just as easily with as a decent human being. The report notes that love is rarely referred to in any analysis of family life, nor in policies or services. It also concludes that love on its own is unlikely to be sufficient to ensure that everyone can flourish. I'm not sure the country is ready for manifestos next year to lead with a pledge on love, but I do think the country is ready for commitments to ensure that everyone in society has their basic needs met. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, referred to the Commission's sentiment that without a roof over our heads, without food and without any money, daily life becomes a huge struggle for survival. And I want to focus a bit on low income. Low income has been found by the Trussell Trust to be the main driver of rising hardship and hunger. When I started doing research on food poverty as a new member of the London Assembly over 10 years ago, my first report aspired to a zero hunger city. The truth is that since then, the aspiration to achieve this, both in London and around the country, is even further away. The Trussell Trust is shockingly expecting to provide over 1 million food parcels this Christmas for the first time, with families with children continue to be the most likely to need support from food banks. I wondered if the Noble Viscount could tell us the government's assessment of the level of hunger in the UK and why it appears to be continuing to rise. What is the government doing to address this, including supporting emergency provision over this Christmas period? Research from Barnardo's has found that families are having to prioritise food and heating over replacing mouldy bedding or broken beds. My noble friend Lord Davies highlighted the need to consider older people, but the report focuses on children, and my comments do as well. Shockingly, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has estimated that around 1 in 5 of the population were living in poverty in 2020 and to 2021, including almost 4 million children. And just this week, we've seen appalling statistics published by UNICEF that say that child poverty in the UK has increased by 19.6% since 2014. How can we have reached a place where the UK is bottom out of all 39 high-income countries considered in this study in terms of worsening child poverty rates? Why does the government believe this to be the case, and what is their strategy for tackling this? Poverty in childhood, as we have heard repeatedly through this debate, has lasting consequences. As the report states, the number of children living in poverty is a barometer of social injustice in the UK today. The report makes it clear that being hungry has significant negative impacts on children's ability to learn. This simply isn't rocket science. A Labour government would be ready to break down the barriers to opportunity. This would include a breakfast club in every primary school so that no child has to start their education day hungry and unable to learn. The Right Reverend Prelate rightly focused on early years in preventing adverse childhood experiences that lead to issues later in life, including issues in offending. Early investment helps, and the report we're debating highlighted the research that demonstrates that the first 1,000 days of a child's life are essential, and my Lordship House debated childcare in early years last week. During the course of that debate, it was made clear that many early years and childcare providers were struggling to stay afloat, and many parents are struggling to pay for childcare, in some cases the cost being higher than their rent or mortgage payments. As has been widely reported, there's a staffing crisis in the sector, and the cost of doing business crisis has also seen thousands of nurseries shutting their doors. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, highlighted the role that family hubs could play in supporting family relationships. Will the Noble Viscount commit to government considering this? Labour would reform childcare and early years. We know that children who are eligible for free school meals are already 5 months behind their peers when they start school. With this in mind, Labour has commissioned an early years review led by the respected former Chief Inspector of Ofsted, Sir David Bell, who will be supported by a panel of independent experts. My noble friend Lord Griffiths gave a powerful and personal account of what threatens families in their dire cases. So housing and claiming processes, barriers that the state can construct and put in the way of families thriving. I'm not going to have an argument with him, however. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Chelmsford, focused on the need for stable, affordable and decent housing. And as the noble Lord Mann also highlighted, there is a dire need for, a extreme need for housing, and income determines what and whether people can afford decent homes. A good start in life can be enhanced by external support, but a safe, warm home is essential. The report we're debating today makes it clear how overcrowding and unsuitable housing can cause stress, depression and anxiety. The housing market in many parts of the country, both urban and rural, and London was mentioned, is effectively broken and pricing people out of decent homes. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Chelmsford, and Lord Davies highlighted the need for multi-generational homes, and the Labour Party plans to build 1.5 million homes over 5 years, including social housing, to provide families with a secure home to build a family, with first-time buyers getting first dibs on new homes. Cold homes or damp homes with mould have been mentioned, and both have physical and mental health impacts. While energy bills and the cost of living have soared under the Tories, Labour's plan to switch on Great British Energy could save struggling families money up to £1,400 a year and ensure that people do not have to choose between heating and eating in the winter. The risk to children of abuse or neglect, my lords, in their own homes was highlighted by the noble Lady Baroness Bottomley. For many children, their home is not a safe place, and this is echoed in the report along with the pressures on the 800,000 young carers looking after a family member that the report refers to. I note and commend the noble Lady Baroness Butler-Sloss's work on child abuse in Cleveland. The need to see children as people with their own voice and needs is key, as she referred to. Listening, which she recommended as a policy, is, in my view, an act of love. With most local authorities under immense financial pressure and some of the statutory services failing to meet urgent need, will the noble Viscount say what more the government will do to avoid children taking on the burden of caring responsibilities? And how will the government ensure that children's social care system can cope with ever-increasing needs? My lords, the report makes it clear that there are many shapes of family, and the protective effect of family depends on the quality of family relationships. It highlights the risks of loneliness and the way COVID-19 exposed this in quite brutal terms. The lasting impact of the pandemic was reflected in the report, which states that the country is picking up the pieces relating to isolation and loneliness, deteriorating mental health, self-neglect, and a huge amount of unresolved grief. Research commissioned by the Greater London Authority, published in 2022, described how 700,000 Londoners experienced severe loneliness even before the pandemic, and this is reflected across the country. The research highlights the major factors that contribute to loneliness, including acute poverty and disability through to prejudices and the challenges associated with major transitions in life. A cross-governmental and cross-societal effort is required to address this, but the government can do more to address the mental health crisis, including introducing the long-awaited mental health bill. The report also highlighted the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and how it highlighted levels of inequality, disadvantage and discrimination in England today, including racial inequalities and discrimination. Can the noble Viscount outline what the government is learning from this ahead of the COVID inquiry reporting, and how the government intends to address this social injustice? The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, highlighted the need to support relationships through marriage preparation, and I should probably declare an interest as somebody who went to a church preparation session before I got married. The potential for more formal signposting by registrars would surely be beneficial to many. My lords, a number of my noble lords have reflected on marriage. The full report goes into some detail on this, including the cost, which I would consider that many people find prohibitive, and maybe one of the reasons for falling numbers of people getting married. Quite clearly, the poverty and strain that comes with poverty puts a strain on relationships, and conflict in relationships harms children. We should recognise that there are clearly cases in which marriages should end where they are not healthy, and this includes violent or financially abusive marriages or relationships which do harm. I welcomed the proposals for greater investment in support for couples at all life transitions, including before marriage, at the start of parenthood and at the point of separation, and to keep children's interests at the heart of this. And the noble Lady Baroness Butler-Sloss highlighted issues with family law, which surely increase many tensions. The full report goes into more detail on single-sex marriage than the summary, including many examples of religious ceremonies within other denominations and faiths where this is permitted. Like the noble Lady Baroness Stoll, I would agree that if marriage is desirable, it should be promoted to the whole of society, and would pay tribute to her work as a minister in taking the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act through this House. I know this is something she worked closely on across the House and cross-party, and recall a picture of her with my noble friend Baroness Thornton holding a placard saying, "Girls marry girls, get over it." I think that you didn't. I know. I know you didn't marry each other. I thank the noble Lord Herbert for sharing his personal and political perspective on the legislation and the joy it has brought to so many people. For institutions to survive, they need to adapt to social change. It is clear that the Commission thought very carefully about how to present what is a clear division of views on the issue of same-sex marriage, and we've heard the counter view from the noble Lord Cormac today. It is welcome that the Church of England has now allowed blessings of same-sex unions, and I hope that in time the current decision not to allow same-sex marriage will be further reviewed by the Church. Finally, I particularly welcome the recognition that couples without children are also family, that families take a range of shapes and sizes, and that singleness should be recognised and honoured as a major part of society. However, this must not be at the expense of failing to recognise the particular pressures of single-parent households and single people, or those without children, in a world that still largely assumes to be a family that is valued, you must have children of your own. As I said at the start, it is unlikely that you will find mainstream political parties putting love as a commitment in their manifestos, but government should recognise that all parts of society, including government, faith groups, civil society and voluntary sector, and those with and without faith, have a role to play in creating a more just society, a fairer society in which every individual and every family and household can flourish.
My Lords, it is an honour to close this debate on Love Matters and the report of the Archbishop's Commission on Families and Households. And I want to start by thanking all noble lords for their valuable contributions today, and in particular the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, for initiating this important debate, but in particular for treating the House to a moving and passionate speech. And if you will excuse the pun, in looking up to the gods, I would also like to thank the Commission for their work done in producing the report. It is a landmark report for the Church, which makes valuable recommendations. And I'd like to assure the House that these have been closely studied by the Government, and they are reflected in Government's plans and actions across the family's agenda. And I will also add that it is rather delightful, perhaps, a delightful change to see that there are more recommendations for the Church than for the Government on this occasion. However, just to reassure the House, that's not to say that there remains much for us to do. As my noble friend Baroness Bottomley referenced, faith groups in the Church are a crucial element in communities around the country and support many families. We do have strong partnerships with the Church, including on the delivery of high-quality education in schools, and I'm going to say more about that later. But just before I begin, just to round up on some of the themes, there were a lot of wide-ranging themes during this afternoon: the importance and value of marriage, including same-sex marriage, and also in the traditional sense, focus on children, views on single-person households and lone parents, relationships generally and the relating better, and how much this matters, focus on the elderly from the noble Lord Davis, the joys or otherwise of being married to an MP, national service for young people, I know cropped up, and also, I think it's fair to say, bad days at the office for benefits officials struck me as being quite interesting. And then an emphasis on friends and neighbours, and we have been exhorted to watch Coronation Street. I think it's next Wednesday, and I must make sure I put that into my diary. Just to start off as well, that I happen to be wearing a tie with an elephant on today, my lords. And the House will know that elephants have deep family bonds. They are loyal to a fault, and they are known to spend time with the relics of their ancestors. So clearly, in that respect, love matters. And I do welcome the report's focus on love, which provides an important reminder of the human element, the bond, the unconditional bond that underlies the entire family's agenda. We all know that children benefit from growing up in a family that provides love, support, and is part of a community. These are the things that ultimately make a difference to children's happiness and success throughout childhood and up through as far as employment. We also know, sadly, that this is not the case for all children, and that some families require greater support. As a result, providing such support to create an environment where all children can thrive is a key priority for this government. That is why in February we published Stable Homes Built on Love. This sets out our vision for a social care system built on love, safety and stability, along with the actions being taken to reform children's social care, a focus shared by the report. And this is just one part of our wider support for families, and I will highlight on some of the further initiatives shortly. Now, the term family does not automatically imply everyone living together under one roof. nor only those who find themselves under the branches of the same family tree. So I do welcome the report's broad definition of family, and in preparation for this debate, I was struck by one particular definition which I personally happened to come across, which goes as follows. Family is loving and supporting one another, even when it is not easy to do so. It is being the best person you could be so that you may inspire your loved ones. Indeed, as my right honourable friend the Prime Minister puts it, quoted by the report, and he quotes, "Whatever your family looks like, it doesn't matter as long as that common bond is love." So I do echo the report's celebration of all forms of loving relationships, as the Most Reverend Primate and also the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, said. They are significant for every individual, whether they opt for a life as a pair within a family unit or as a single person. We must respect and recognise the different family arrangements and structures so that we can provide the right types of support. However, I listened very carefully to my noble friend Baroness Stoll, and also my noble friend Lord Cormac and my noble friend Lord Robotham. They spoke passionately, and particularly my noble friend Lady Stoll, about the value and benefit of marriage and the need to keep promoting this, and is absolutely right. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, echoed the view, which was raised also by the Baroness Twycross, that the marriage ceremony is enormously important, and the preparation for the ceremony, preparing for the commitment of marriage, was at the heart of this. And the Right Reverend Prelate cited a role model for this at the Holy Trinity, Brompton. And I should also declare an interest that I believe that I am a beneficiary of good preparation for marriage, having just last June celebrated 35 years. Not quite as many as some other in the chamber. I also noted the question raised by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, about the registrar and a role, in terms of the registrar possibly doing some signalling. I will reflect on that, and I will certainly get back to him, and also put a letter in the House Library regarding that important point. But in terms of supporting marriage, can I just remind the House that the government does indeed support marriage and the institution of marriage, and the House will know that we introduced the marriage allowance in 2015 to recognise marriage and civil partnerships in the tax system as just one example of our support for marriage. And the government also has a strong track record of advancing LGBT rights, including the introduction of same-sex marriage in 2013. And can I say also that I was deeply moved by the speech from my noble friend Lord Herbert. The Most Reverend Primate mentioned the importance of state intervention where needed, and the noble Lord Davis added in at different stages, and I think he was alluding to the reference made to the elderly, and I'll come back to that hopefully with time later. My Lords, let me directly address what support the government is providing on issues that affect families. As my noble friend Baroness Bottomley highlighted, my own department, DWP, oversees the Reducing Parental Conflict programme, which shows that supporting parents inter alia to reduce the damage of frequent arguing, and I make that point, frequent arguing, not just arguing, very damaging, achieves positive and sustained impacts for children. This programme is delivered through local authority family services and with local community and faith partners. And the Most Reverend Primate emphasised the importance of local action in this respect, and he's right. We continue to provide ongoing support for local authorities across England on this programme and are on track to have directly supported 40,000 parents in the last 2 years. In addition, the Start for Life and Family Hubs programme have created a network of centres for families with children up to 19 or up to 25 years where the child has a disability. These family hubs link professionals, local partners and faith groups to support families. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, spoke about family hubs very eloquently, and they also support the very important early years development, which I know is a priority for the Royal Foundation and Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales. And I'm sure that the House will welcome the joined-up support being given by midwives and family hub workers to expectant and new parents, helping them with both their child's and their own health and well-being. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, asked how the government will ensure that faith groups are involved in family hubs and that they provide the necessary relationships advice. And he's right. Faith groups are at the heart of many communities and therefore are a key component of the family hub model. We have published guidance for local authorities on the services we expect family hubs to offer, including helping families access support for separating and separated parents and to reduce parental conflict. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, in another passionate speech, spoke about children with a parent in prison, a very important subject. A parent going into prison can have a profound impact on children, which I would say is an understatement. Local agencies are best placed here to determine what support is needed. For example, keeping children safe in education, statutory guidance for schools states that the additional needs of children with a family member in prison or who are affected by parental offending should be considered. My Lords, healthy relationships are built on a foundation of mutual respect, trust and honest communication. In schools, our children are being taught about the importance of healthy relationships through the inclusion of age-appropriate relationship, sex and health education within the curriculum. This helps them to develop mutually respectful relationships more broadly. But that's not all the help that they get on relationships. School mental health teams are already making a difference when relationships get tough, to help children address problems early before they escalate. My Lords, the reality is that not all relationships stand the test of time, and the noble Lord Griffiths put it very well when he said, "Bad things happen." Indeed they do. Last year, we introduced the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act. This legislation has modernised divorce laws and created an online divorce service to help with financial settlements and childcare arrangements after separation. In addition, the Child Maintenance Service, which I'm directly responsible for, plays a crucial role in securing financial support for children where parents have separated by mandating and, where necessary, enforcing, my Lords, appropriate arrangements so that children have the best start in life with a solid financial foundation. Through both private family-based arrangements and more formal child maintenance service arrangements, on average, looking at the years 2020 to 2022, 160,000 children were kept out of absolute low income on an after-housing costs basis. But despite this progress, I know there is much more that we can do, and that's why in October my department announced measures to strengthen the child maintenance service by accelerating our enforcement powers and removing the £20 application fee. We will also be consulting on the ways in which the child maintenance service collects and transfers maintenance payments, all with the primary aim of getting more funds to children. And my noble friend Lord Robotham is right to mention that it is mainly men, 93%, who have strayed in a marriage. But can I also emphasise that not all do not take responsibilities for their children. So it's a complicated story. The Right Reverend Bishop, the Prelate, Bishop of Durham, spoke about the two-child limit, which I certainly was expecting to do so this afternoon. He will know probably what my answer will be, but just very briefly, and I think my noble friend Baroness Stoll alluded to this, the two-child limit has been extensively debated in this House, as he knows. On inception, the policy had two clear intentions. Firstly, to make universal credit fairer and more affordable to the taxpayer, but secondly, to ensure that those supporting themselves through benefits face the same financial choices around the number of children that they can afford to have as those not on benefits. And the House will be aware of the exceptions that apply. And child benefit continues to be paid for all children on ineligible families. But, my Lords, going further, in 2014, as the Right Reverend Primate highlighted, we introduced the family test, which guides policymakers in assessing the potential effects of their decisions on family dynamics, including elements related to marriage. The family test is for individual departments to apply. This approach allows for flexibility to consider the test at the most appropriate points in the policy-making process. My Lords, in my role, I have actively supported the family test, and I remain committed to promoting it across government. And I do want to say a few more words about this, because I know the most Reverend Primate regards this as being very important. We acknowledge that some people, including himself, might like to see consideration and publication of the family test become a statutory obligation. To work best, an assessment of the potential family impacts of policies needs to be done early in the policy development process so that consideration can be given to adapting proposals. Feedback from policymakers tells us that statutory test risks becoming a box-ticking exercise at the end of the policy process with pass or fail outcomes. However, perhaps I can reassure him and the House that we continue to work across government to support officials developing policy to apply the family test from the earliest policy development stages and encourage the sharing of best practice. And we're also starting work across government to consider the language of the family test questions and supporting guidance. We really do want to ensure that it continues to be relevant and appropriate and acknowledge the recommendations in the report, but also the Children's Commissioner's report. My Lords, let me now turn to some other matters that were raised in the report, and that includes reducing poverty and supporting low-income families. The government believes it has a strong track record of helping vulnerable families. There were a number of questions from the Noble Baroness Lady Twycross, and I think I will need to write a letter because there are an awful lot of them, but I will be touching later on housing, which was a general theme that came up during the debate, and hopefully some answers may come to her from that. The House, however, will be aware of the £276 billion being spent on welfare in Great Britain over the period 2023 to 24. Now, I'm not going to rehearse all the autumn statement announcements because the House has heard this on several occasions in the past 2 weeks or so. But I would like to, as I said earlier, focus on housing, and I know the Noble Lord Mann raised this. The Most Reverend Primate also spoke about the importance of family, where they live and how they live, and the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Chelmsford, spoke about the types of houses, the intergenerational focus on the buildings, and frankly, making it a lot better for families to live near each other so that you've got the influence of the intergenerational aspects of it. I think these are incredibly important points which I'm certainly taking on board. In the meantime, the government, as the House will know, in the autumn statement, is raising the local housing allowance rates to the 30th percentile of local market rents in April 2024, and this will benefit 1.6 million low-income households by on average £800 a year in 2024-25, and of course helping many who are in poverty. And the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Chelmsford, asked about timing. I will certainly take her point back about perhaps bringing the date forward, but I certainly can't offer any reassurance on that. The report rightly identifies many of the features that support families flourishing, including friendship, shelter, and the ability to deal with conflict. But I would like, my Lords, to highlight the importance of work, and I have to say slightly amazed that this has not been raised at all during this debate, and I would like to take this opportunity to focus on this. It has been a long-standing principle for this government that the most effective and sustainable way to tackle poverty is by championing employment, acknowledging the mental health benefit that this brings, and supporting people, including parents, to progress in work. Work can be an important part of bringing families together, supporting their mental health, and role modelling positive behaviours for younger generations. This government is committed to improving lives by ensuring more people can reap the rewards of work. The voluntary in-work progression offer is now available in all job centres across Great Britain. We estimate that around 1.2 million low-paid workers will be eligible for support to progress into higher-paid work, and we'll be encouraging them to take up this offer. Then, turning to childcare and the actions of my department to support parents into work. From June 2023, we increased the universal credit childcare cost caps by 47% to £951 a month for one child and £1,630 a month for families with 2 or more children. And importantly, we can now also provide even more help with upfront childcare costs when parents move into work or increase their hours. I would like to reiterate my appreciation to faith groups and their commitment to parents, carers and children, and I'm very grateful to the Commission for its invaluable contributions to supporting and strengthening family life since it was established in March 2021. And I just want to raise one very important point, which is the role of grandparents. And I know that the Noble Lord Davis referenced the elderly in his remarks, but I would also like to thank the Noble Lord Mann profusely for raising this important subject, because I think the intergenerational aspects of grandparents, the importance of them playing a pivotal role in families, often stepping up to provide kinship care and support to children and their parents. Many kinship carers, especially grandparents, take on this role at a time in their lives when they were least expecting to raise a family, which we would guess. They provide support, sage advice and stability, forging strong relationships, not out of duty, but because love matters. I would like to just answer a question raised by the Noble Lord Davis. And this is to do with the question of having a cabinet-level minister for children. Perhaps I can be helpful by saying, of course, he will know that we have children's minister, but that's not his point. The Secretary of State for Education actually fulfills the role of cabinet-level minister. She makes sure that the best interests of children and families are front and centre in policy and decision-making at this highest level of government. She has a statutory duty to promote the well-being of children in England under the Children and Young Persons Act 2008 and is responsible for overseeing domestic implementation of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child and leading the reporting process on behalf of the UK to the UN. The Minister for Children, Families and Wellbeing also chairs a cross-government child protection ministerial group. This group helps to ensure that safeguarding is championed at the highest level by government departments that provide services to children and families. And through this group, the Secretary of State also ensures other government departments are held to account in delivering for children. My Lords, this government is committed to delivering on issues that matter to the British people, and that is why we will continue with our mission to help all families to thrive and our young people to grow up within them and to flourish.
Before the Minister sits down, I just want to...
He has.
Carry on.
He's still standing.
I want to ask him, did he use a word in this section on divorce advisedly? He referred to a proportion, a percentage of men who had strayed, which to me suggests an element of blame, whereas I thought the whole thrust of developments in divorce law are for the law to avoid allocating blame.
It's absolutely right. Can I just clarify to the Noble Lord, I was not attaching any blame. I was just making a factual point that it's the 93% of men who stray. There is a balance that we strike within the child maintenance service to be sure that we take account of the issues relating to paying parents and also receiving parents. It's very important that we do not take sides, but we also have the facts to look at.
My Lords, this has been a remarkable debate, and I'm extremely grateful to all those who've taken part. Given that I'm sure everyone is anxiously awaiting the answer to the P&Q, I will try not to take too long. The Minister is just poised to leap up and give the answer. I'm just going to pick up one or 2 points, but I do want to thank all those who contributed and all those who have been so kind about the Commission. I'm sure they will find out about those kind words, and who have clearly read the report or its summary very carefully. It was described as quietly explosive by the Noble Baroness Thornhill. That is such a wonderful Anglican expression. I felt my heart sang at the thought that the Church of England had discovered a way to be quietly explosive. It's such a very Anglican thing to be. We wouldn't like to be noisily explosive any more than we'd like to be enthusiastic. I particularly wanted to pay tribute to Baroness Stowell. I'm one of those who was here when the Equal Marriage Act went through. I was very new in post at the time, and I do remember the graciousness and the care and attention that was paid, which ensured it was absolutely undefeatable, unopposable, even for those of us who did. It was put so well and done so carefully with respect to all sides involved in the debate. I think it was a model for how that sort of controversial subject can be handled in Parliament, and I think it's a good thing to remember that and to remember it with gratitude, and in so doing to say the same thing to the noble Lord Herbert, who played a very, very significant role in that. While speaking of the noble Lord Herbert's speech, I was grateful for his mention of the complexity of the Anglican Communion. And I would like, just for the record, to make it clear that the primates of the Anglican Communion, the Lambeth Conference of Worldwide Bishops, and the Anglican Consultative Council have on numerous occasions emphasized their opposition to the criminalization of same-sex relationships in any way, in the broad sense of the word. And in fact, to treating those who are lesbian or gay or transsexual, treating them in any way as other, as condemning and opposing them. And I want to re-emphasize my full agreement with the opposition to criminalization. And I'm glad to say that if you go back to 1967, you'll find that my illustrious predecessor, Archbishop Ramsey, was one of those who led the campaign for decriminalization in this country. I regret, as was made clear, the legislation in Uganda, and I regret in other places where it was emphasized by colonial legislation. I also oppose very strongly the death penalty, and to combine the two is the worst of all possible worlds. Though it is worth, I'm not defending their legislation anyway at all, because I opposed it and I oppose it publicly, but it is certainly true to say that in that particular law, which I had to read, the aggravated homosexuality, as they call it, not my words, includes, as far as I could see, only those things which in this country are criminal anyway, such as offences against children. But that does not defend the law. I think, picking up on the comments about marriage, which I think are really important ones, and the noble Lord Rowbottom and the noble Baroness Stowell quite rightly raised that. In fact, in the full report, there are 300 mentions of marriage across the full report, and it does come in number 5 of the key conclusions in the summary report. In one sense, yes, there are a number of other things we didn't mention. It doesn't mean that we don't support them vigorously. Look at what the Church does as well as what it says. And day by day, my own experience as a parish priest and in doing preparation for marriage couples and seeing the number of marriages going up in my own parish when I was a parish priest from 8 to nearly 40 in my last year in that particular post. I would say the Church day by day shows its commitment in its active support for marriage. The issues around same-sex marriage, your lordships will be relieved to know that I am not going to ride off on that hobby horse, save to say that I appreciate the sympathy of the noble Lord Cormac for trying to square that circle. Marriage is extremely important, but it isn't a magic wand. Domestic abuse, the figures show, happens as much within marriages with step-parents and, tragically, with grandparents and with other, mainly men, involved in the family as much as it does in other ways. And that is one of the reasons that the report carefully emphasizes that marriage is of enormous importance, but it is not a panacea. It's not something that makes all life go well always. Children want both parents in their lives. But that's not always for the best if marriages are broken. It's true. That's my own experience. Yes, fathers must fulfill their responsibility, but holding a marriage together is tragically not always the safest and best way for the children in the marriage. The noble Lord Davies, in a memorable speech, quite rightly drew attention to the need to take care of the use of the word family, and I hope we tried to do that sufficiently in the report. He also quite rightly raised the question of old age in the Church of England. Old age, as in your noble lordship's house, is something with which we are relatively familiar, given that the average age of members is 69, or round about there. Many of the members of your lordship's house today would qualify for the youth groups in most of our churches. Baroness Butler, the noble Baroness Butler Sloss, who in my notes for some reason I've written down as Bishop Butler Sloss, which was slightly confusing me. She is wearing club. She talked about the importance of listening to children. That has to be one of the key ways in which, as the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, mentioned several times, the need that we provide support. It is the support comes in listening. And in Holy Trinity Brampton's marriage course, now used very effectively all over the world, and for some time in an adapted form, a compulsory run-up to marriage in 3 provinces in China for anyone wanting to get married. I trust the noble Lord Rowbottom feels that is what governments should intervene in and make it all absolutely compulsory. But it has made a huge difference. All our own children who've got married have used the course, and many of my colleagues, young colleagues at Lambeth Palace. I'm not going to repeat everything that was said by the Bishop of Durham or the Bishop of Gloucester or the Bishop of Chelmsford. So safe to say that I agreed with them entirely. The noble Baroness Bottomley commended the Positive Parenting Alliance. I'd like to emphasise that, and I'd like to thank her for mentioning Reverend Clive Potter, and it's just typical of what happens in most parishes most of the time in this country, and you could get rid of the House of Bishops tomorrow and it'd be years before anyone noticed the difference. But if you got rid of the parish priest, the whole thing collapses overnight. The noble Lord Mann alluded both to the role of grandparents, I agree entirely about that, the importance of multi-generational families, and that is especially important to encourage because it is a great source of resilience, and to the problem of isolation, which is why we must take the concept of families in the widest sense. We had a marvellous passing comment, I can't quite remember who by, to that old chestnut about bishops always voting against this government. I know. I was being tactful.
No, you can be honest.
Yes. You'll find we did the same thing in the Labour government in the first. Yes, you remember well. I mean, it's just a general principle. We sit on these benches. It's nothing new, and it won't change in the future. It is, of course, a misuse of statistics. We did support the government in stopping the Illegal Migration Act being voted out. We did support the government on the Brexit Act after the referendum. If I'd picked that session, it'd be 90% the other way. It all goes to show that statistics have their uses, but not always their illuminations. I think on the two-parent limit, that is a serious point, and the Minister and I know that we will disagree on this, But the point about it, and this is why it's not a political sense a political comment in the sense of a cheap, sort of low comment, is that it penalises children for what happens to the parents. And that is the wrong thing to do. A child that is born and happens to be the third child, because even if the parents have irresponsibly not thought about their budget before making love, as I'm sure the noble lords always think about their budget in those circumstances, but just because they haven't, it's not right to penalise the resulting child. A family that's had 4 children when their circumstances were good, and then there's disability, illness, well, these things happen. That is why we raise the moral question about whether it's right to penalise the children, even if, which I don't always, or very seldom, even if one agrees that the parents have been irresponsible. The parents may have paid their taxes, their NI, for years, and at a moment of need, as Beveridge encouraged, they look for social security. I was particularly struck by Lord Addington's speech, and noble Lord was looking for how you describe a collection of bishops. I could use many, many descriptions, but I think the technical phrase is a psalter of bishops. I am informed. If I'm wrong, I apologise to the House. I've never used that one. But I particularly thought his comment, as he said he's used it before, to be a successful disabled child, choose your parents carefully. The importance of family support in disability saves the state more money than we can begin to imagine. And it always has done and always will. We have a child with learning difficulties. Do we look after her because she looks after us in many ways, but do we care for her because we're paid? Of course not. We care for her because we love her. But even in our family with excellent education and lots of experience, navigating the benefit system is a really tough thing to do. And I commend that as a thought for the Minister. And finally, almost finally, just as before he goes, because I couldn't miss, I thought the noble Lord Griffith's speech was one of the absolute outstanding speech of the debate, just wonderful, and short. Short in the you can't, exactly, I'm trying to get there. Marriage, what the noble Lord made me reflect was marriages can be good or bad. They are not an end in themselves, but they are a means to an end. And I think his comments about Jerusalem artichokes, which, by the way, in French are topinambours, and since you asked, yes, not quite sure why, and particularly to the ways in which the Beveridge report resulted in the most extraordinary series of legislation from which he and his family benefited in one of the most extraordinary periods of legislative action in this Parliament. That speech brought home how government action can facilitate, but is not sufficient to make families work well. So I'm very grateful for that speech. I would finally come back to thank the Minister very, very much for an excellent closing speech. He quite rightly mentioned work, which made me think of the numerous churches with job clubs helping people to get back into work, but that is a very important to mention. And I thank him for picking up the points so beautifully through the speech, through his answer. Two final things. I think this debate shows how the different aspects of what we've been talking about all interlink. We cannot silo these issues. Housing helps families, care helps families, education helps families, government operates and the church operates in different departments. How we cross over those silos is probably the hardest test for any administration. That has been shown by a series of really powerful and thoughtful speeches in answer to a powerful and thoughtful report. And finally, on the question of marriage, you may note a faint tone of defensiveness here. I really pick up the point that was made by the noble lord and by the noble baroness about not mentioning it enough. I am a regular reader, as the benches over here will no doubt have guessed, of a notorious left-wing magazine, which I read every week, called The Spectator. I read it to keep my blood pressure up. And it works extremely well. On one occasion, it described me as uxorious. It was a diary article by the noble Lord, Lord Moore. Funny how it sticks in your mind. I had to go and look it up. It means unnaturally devoted to marriage. That is my final defence, my lord.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as that opinion shall say content.
Content.
The contrary not contents. The contents have it. Private notice question on the Rwanda Treaty. Additional costs. Lord Collins of Highbury.
Yeah. My Lords, I beg leave to ask a question of which I have given private notice. The question is as follows: to ask His Majesty's Government what additional costs they expect to be incurred as a result of this week's signing of a treaty